The storm began the night after Christmas, the kind that turns the whole world quiet before it tries to kill you. I was driving north through rural Montana, taking the long way home after visiting my sister in Billings. I'd made the mistake of ignoring the weather warnings. I'd shrugged off her pleading and the news alerts that flashed across the TV. Whiteout conditions, extreme wind chill, power outages expected. I'd told myself I'd driven through worse. I'd grown up in this state, after all. I hadn't driven through something like this. By the time I turned off the highway onto the two-lane road leading toward Great Falls, the wind was howling so hard it felt like something alive. The snow didn't fall so much as it blasted sideways, blinding, thick, a wall of white. My truck shuddered with each gust like it was about to lift off the pavement. The lines on the road disappeared, then the edges of the road, until it felt like I was driving across nothing at all. I should have stopped. I should have turned around. But the temperature was already dropping fast. Negative teens, negative 20s with wind chill, and the idea of pulling to the shoulder felt like waiting to freeze. I kept crawling forward, squinting into the high beams, trying to convince myself I could make out the faintest outline of fence posts on the left. When the road curved east, my tires caught a sheet of ice. The truck fishtailed, skidded, spun once, twice, before sliding off the crown of the road and dropping nose first into a drift that swallowed half the hood. Airbag dust filled my nose. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. When I stepped out to check the front end, the cold slapped me so hard I lost my breath. The wind ripped at my jacket and the snow stung like needles. My boots sank a foot into powder. I crouched by the headlights, but with the storm screaming around me, I could hardly see my own hands. It didn't take a mechanic to know the truck was going nowhere. The only help out here came from one of the ranch houses that dotted the region, and those were miles apart. I checked my phone. No bars, of course. Even the emergency signal flickered and died. The storm ate everything. That's when I saw the light, a soft amber glow through the white swirl, flickering like from a lantern. It wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile across an open field. A house, probably. Maybe someone with a landline. Heat. Shelter. I didn't think twice. I locked the truck, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and pushed into the wind. Every step was a fight. The snow was deeper than it looked, and the gusts shoved me sideways. Halfway there, I lost sight of the light completely. Panic seeped in, but I kept moving, following the faint, warm blur whenever it reappeared between the gusts. By the time I reached the fence line near the house, my legs were shaking and my face burned with frostbite. The house wasn't large, 2 stories, wood siding, dark roof heavily bowed with snow. The light I'd followed leaked from a first-floor window. The rest of the place was pitch black. It looked old, abandoned even, but something inside was glowing. I stumbled to the porch, stomped the snow off my boots, and knocked. No answer. The door wasn't locked, though. It creaked open with a push. Warm air washed out. That alone should have bothered me. No running truck, no generator noise. In a storm like this, warmth meant someone had power or fire going. But the house was silent. Inside, the warmth felt uneven. Pockets of it, like heat soaked into the walls instead of coming from a furnace. The entryway smelled faintly of smoke, but nothing was burning. The place looked preserved. Dust on the shelves, furniture draped with white sheets. A dark hallway ahead. Still, I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here? I got stuck in the storm." No answer. I stepped farther in. The light I'd seen came from a lantern sitting on a wooden table in a living room to the right. An old-fashioned lantern, the kind that burned oil. But when I leaned in, it wasn't hot. The flame inside wasn't real. It flickered strangely, too steady, too silent. As I reached toward it, something scraped on the hardwood behind me. I spun. Nothing. "Hello?" My voice cracked. The storm shrieked outside. The house didn't. I should have left right then, walked back to the truck and taken my chances, but the moment I turned toward the door, I heard something upstairs. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Measured. Someone was home. "Hey," I shouted up the stairwell. "I'm sorry to barge in. My truck's busted and..." The footsteps stopped. "Do you have a phone?" I called. "Or a radio?" Silence. Then a soft dragging sound like something being pulled across carpet. I took a step back, hand instinctively reaching into my pocket, even though I had nothing. No weapon, not even a pocket knife. The dragging stopped. The air shifted. Warmth pressed against my back like someone standing too close. I whipped around, but again there was no one. That was when the lantern went out. The room plunged into darkness. My heart hammered. I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight, but it wouldn't wake. Screen black, unresponsive, even though it had been half charged. I forced myself to breathe and retreated toward the hallway, hoping to find a wall and feel my way to the door. Before I reached it, a shape moved at the top of the stairs. Black against black, but darker, something tall. Broad shoulders, a crooked silhouette that bent at an unnatural angle. "Hello?" I whispered. It didn't answer. It didn't breathe. It just stood there. Then it descended the stairs without a sound. Not one footstep. I backed away until I hit the wall. My numb hands scraped across old wallpaper. The shape reached the bottom step and paused. The storm howled behind the walls. My pulse thudded in my throat. Then it stepped into view, only a foot from me, and wasn't a person at all. It was a coat. A long, old-fashioned winter coat. Heavy wool, dark, hanging from a mount on the wall. The shadow I'd seen was just the coat moving from the draft. I let out a shaky laugh, half relief, half hysteria. Jesus. Okay. But the laugh died when I noticed something else. The coat was dripping, not snow, not melting ice. Dark, thick droplets that hit the floorboards with soft taps. Blood, fresh. I staggered back just as a thump sounded upstairs. Not footsteps. Something heavy falling, rolling, stopping. The hairs rose on my neck. The storm outside rattled the windows so violently I wondered if they might burst. The lights flickered, not lantern light, actual house lights from somewhere deeper in the hall. They buzzed faintly like an old generator kicking on, then steadied. For the first time, I saw the hallway clearly. Family photos lined the walls. Except the faces had been scratched out. All of them. Every single picture. Long gouges where eyes and mouths should be, some frames smashed, some photos torn. Then a cold breath washed over the back of my neck. I froze. Slowly, very slowly, I turned my head. There was no one behind me, but the coat, now on the floor, was inches from my feet. It had moved. I stumbled backward, but the moment I did, all the lights in the house went out again. The darkness swallowed everything, and something breathed in the doorway upstairs. I heard it clearly this time. Wet, raspy inhalations, like lungs struggling to drag in frozen air. It moved, slow and deliberate, toward the stairs. I didn't wait. Keeping one hand on the wall, I followed the memory of where the door should be. The wind outside screamed through the cracks, guiding me. My fingers brushed the doorknob. The breathing moved faster. So did I. I yanked the door open and a hand grabbed the back of my jacket. Ice-cold fingers curled around the fabric. I screamed, kicked backward, twisted. The hand slipped. I dove into the blizzard, slamming the door behind me. Snow blasted into my face. The cold felt like knives, but it was better than whatever waited in that house. I sprinted toward where I thought the truck was, barely seeing anything. The wind shoved me, the drifts swallowed my legs, but adrenaline pushed me forward. When I reached the truck, I threw myself inside and slammed the door. I locked it without thinking. My breaths came in white bursts. Then I saw the tracks, not mine, leading from the house, circling the truck. Twice. 3 times, as if something had been waiting for me to return. My vision blurred. I wiped frost from the inside of the windshield to look again, but the tracks were already filling with fresh snow. Disappearing. Then, from the back seat, something exhaled. Slow. Deep. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The breath grew closer, warm against my ear despite the freezing air. A voice followed, low and cracked like ice splitting on a lake. "You shouldn't have left the house." The last thing I remembered was the storm roaring louder and the world going black. I woke in a hospital 2 days later. A snowplow driver had found me unconscious in my truck on the side of the highway, half frozen. They told me there were no houses anywhere near where I'd crashed. No tracks except my own. No footprints, no signs of anyone living or dead. When I insisted there had been a house, a 2-story farmhouse, they exchanged the kind of looks medical staff give when someone is confused or traumatized. They explained gently that the nearest building on that road had burned down in the late 1970s after the family inside froze during a brutal winter storm. They'd found the bodies near the front door, huddled together as if trying to escape something inside. The house had never been rebuilt. I know what I saw, what I felt, what touched me, what breathed behind me. I know I didn't imagine those tracks in the snow. I don't drive that road anymore. I don't drive in winter at all. And sometimes at night, when the wind picks up and rattles my windows, swear I hear that same ragged breathing in the hallway outside my bedroom, like something followed me home. Story. The end. The first flakes began from falling on the morning of December 12th, light and airy, almost playful. By nightfall, the world outside the small town of Ellington, Vermont, had transformed into a silent white wasteland. Streets vanished beneath drifts of snow, and the once familiar outline of the forest behind Maple Street disappeared into an endless expanse of frost. It was the kind of winter that made people lock their doors a little tighter and check on their neighbors a little more often. The kind that seemed beautiful from a distance but carried a latent menace underneath its sparkling veneer. Sarah Jennings had moved to Ellington only 3 months prior. She had grown up in the Midwest, where winters were harsh but predictable, and she thought she knew what cold could do to a person. She quickly learned she was wrong. Vermont's winters had a way of sneaking into your bones, of twisting the wind so it cut sharper than a knife. She had moved into a small cabin on the outskirts of town, a modest 2-bedroom built in the 1940s, which her realtor assured her was charmingly rustic. It was charming in daylight. By night, it carried a sense of isolation she hadn't anticipated. The first night of the snowstorm was manageable. Sarah had lit a fire in the stone hearth and wrapped herself in a thick quilt. Outside, the wind whined, rattling the windows as if the house itself were trembling. She told herself it was just the storm, just winter. But as the hours stretched on, the wind shifted, carrying sounds she couldn't place, low, dragging groans that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. At first, she chalked it up to her imagination, or perhaps the house settling. But when a shadow moved across the far wall outside, something in her stomach tightened. She approached the window cautiously. The snow had fallen so heavily that visibility was nearly zero, but there, for a brief moment, she saw a figure, tall, hunched, impossibly still. She blinked, and it was gone. Her pulse quickened. "Just a tree," she muttered, but her own voice sounded foreign in the stillness. That night, sleep came in fitful, shallow bursts. Every creak of the cabin sounded like a step, every gust like someone breathing down her neck. By morning, the snow had buried everything. Her small mailbox had disappeared under a 4-foot drift, and the road outside was impassable. Sarah tried calling her neighbors, but the storm had knocked out cell towers. Even her landline crackled with static and then fell silent. She wasn't worried yet. Storms were normal, but a gnawing unease had settled into her chest. Something about the way the forest loomed beyond her yard, completely white yet impossibly dark, felt alive, watching. The second night brought the full force of the storm. Snow pounded against the cabin like fists, and the wind howled in unnatural rhythms. Sarah sat in the living room with a flashlight and a thick sweater, hoping the fire would hold. She kept seeing shadows flicker at the edges of her vision, and she kept telling herself it was just the dance of light. Then she heard it, a tapping, faint at first, like fingernails rapping against glass. She froze. The sound came again, closer this time, then a scraping, like claws against wood. Her heart raced, but she forced herself to investigate. She wrapped herself in a coat and stepped toward the window, peering through the frosted glass. The figure from the previous night stood there again, just beyond the snowbank, staring at her. Its face was obscured by a hood, but its presence radiated something cold and terrible, like the frost itself had taken form. When she blinked, it vanished, leaving only the wind and the snow as though it had never been there. She told herself she was losing it. She was trapped, isolated, and afraid. Of course, her mind was conjuring shadows. She returned to the hearth, trying to convince herself she was safe, but the tapping continued intermittently through the night, now accompanied by low moans that seemed to echo from the forest, traveling across the snow like waves. The next morning, she found tracks in the snow leading from the tree line to her cabin. They were humanoid. She could tell by the stride, but far too large for any human. The prints sank deep into the snow, as if whatever made them carried weight beyond reason. The tracks stopped abruptly at the edge of her porch, as though the creature had paused to study her, then retreated. Her rational mind wanted to dismiss it, maybe a deer, maybe a fallen branch dragging through the snow, but something primal in her gut screamed that this was wrong. By the third night, the storm hadn't let up. She rationed the last of her food and tried not to look outside. The tapping escalated to pounding, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone or something was testing her walls. She could hear it circling the cabin. Every time she peeked through the frosted windows, there was nothing, yet she could feel it. Weight shifting just beyond sight, waiting, patient. Sleep became impossible. She huddled under her quilt, listening to the wind, listening to the tapping, listening to the low moans that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. Around 3 a.m., there was a loud crash. The back door shook violently, as if something massive had rammed it. She bolted upright, heart hammering, and grabbed the old hunting rifle she had left leaning in the corner. Through the peephole, she saw it, a figure emerging from the snow. It was taller than any human, shoulders hunched unnaturally, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its movements were deliberate and eerily silent, gliding across the snow toward her door. Sarah's fingers trembled on the rifle. She shouted, her voice cracking, and fired once through the door. The sound was deafening in the small cabin, but there was no reaction. The figure continued forward, stopping just short of the door, its face still hidden beneath the hood. The moaning intensified, surrounding the cabin, coming from every direction at once. Sarah ran to the fireplace, desperately trying to build a bigger fire, knowing instinctively that heat and light were her only defenses. The figure at the door stayed, frozen like a statue, until the fire blazed high enough to illuminate the room. In that moment, she caught a glimpse of its face, hollow eyes reflecting the flames, skin pale and taut, lips pulled back in a permanent snarl. And then it vanished, melting into the white storm like smoke. Morning brought no relief. The storm had finally eased, leaving a crystalline wasteland. Sarah ventured outside, rifle in hand, to examine the aftermath. The tracks were gone, erased by fresh snow, as though whatever had come through had never existed. But she found something else. Small, dark marks scorched into the earth where the firelight had touched the creature the night before. They weren't footprints. They were impressions, burned into the ground, radiating outward in a twisted spiral pattern. Weeks later, when the storm melted and the roads were cleared, neighbors came by to check on her. She tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed her. Some suggested cabin fever. Others joked about overactive imagination. Yet when they looked at the back porch, they couldn't ignore the spiral marks scorched into the wood, a pattern no human or animal could have made. Sarah stayed in the cabin for another month before deciding she couldn't endure it any longer. She left one icy morning, packed into her car, glancing nervously at the forest as she drove away. Every few miles, she felt the weight of unseen eyes watching from the snow, and in her rearview mirror, shadows seemed to shift with the sunlight, flickering just beyond the edge of vision. Years later, she heard stories of people vanishing in Vermont winters, travelers who had disappeared on quiet roads, or hikers who never returned from the forest. Some said it was wolves, others blamed black bears. But Sarah knew better. She had seen it, felt it, and she knew that winter held its own predators, ones that weren't human, ones that didn't belong to the world of warmth and hearth. No one in Ellington spoke openly about the disappearances, but every winter, residents left lights burning in their windows and extra firewood stacked at their doors. The locals learned the unspoken rule: never travel alone after a heavy snowfall, never stray too far from warmth, and never, ever listen to the soft scratching or low moans carried by the wind, because those sounds were never the wind. They were the first signs that whatever lurked beyond the snow had noticed you and was patient enough to wait. Sarah never returned to her cabin. She sold it, and the new owners moved in, excited by the quaintness and isolation. By the end of their first winter, they too reported strange noises, shadows in the snow, and the feeling of being watched. One night, the husband swore he saw a figure at the back door, tall and cloaked, standing silently in the drifting snow. The next morning, the woman found spiral scorch marks on the porch, burned into the wood in the same unnatural pattern. By then, Sarah had moved 3 states away, living in a city where winter meant slush and gray skies, and no snowstorms could ever carry the horror she had witnessed. But sometimes, late at night, she dreams of the snow, of the tall figure with hollow eyes, of the spirals etched into the earth. And in those dreams, she feels the cold stare of the winter outside her window, patient and eternal, reminding her that some winters are alive and they never forget. Story the end. The snow came early that year, settling over the small town of Merrow Creek like a white blanket too thick to shake off. The streets were quiet, muffled by inches of fresh snow, and the kind of quiet that makes the hair on your arms stand up. Most residents stayed inside, tending to fireplaces and winter storms with mugs of coffee or spiced cider. But not everyone had the luxury of staying put. Tom Reynolds, a maintenance worker for the local power company, was driving the narrow back roads late that evening. He had a service call for a downed line at the edge of the woods, a spot locals avoided after dark. The snow fell harder, coating his windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. Every turn of the road was a surprise, and he had to drive with one hand on the wheel, squinting through the blur. He remembered the warnings from the dispatcher. "Be careful out there, Tom. It's bad up by Miller's Hollow. The wind's picking up. We've had reports of stranded cars." He laughed it off to himself, imagining the exaggerated stories of panicked drivers lost in snowdrifts. But as he turned off the main road onto the dirt path that led to the line, the headlights caught something, or someone, standing at the edge of the trees. Tom slowed. It was a man, or at least what looked like a man, swaying slightly as if caught in the wind. He wore a dark coat and a hat pulled down low. The snow covered him, almost blending him into the shadows of the trees. Tom called out, "Hey, you okay?" The figure turned, and Tom could finally see the face. Pale, frozen, eyes wide, glassy. A scream froze in Tom's throat as the man, or what was left of him, collapsed sideways into the snow. The wind carried the sound, or maybe it was just the howling trees, but it felt like it had carried a warning. Tom jumped out of his truck, boots sinking into the powder, his breath steaming in the cold. The body was stiff, ice forming around the fingertips, and hair sticking in clumps of frost. It wasn't just cold death. It was wrong. His jacket had been shredded, and the flesh underneath was mottled, almost gray. He fumbled for his radio, hands shaking. "Dispatch, this is Reynolds. I found someone. Down by the hollow. I need backup." Static. Then the dispatcher's calm voice. "Copy that, Tom. Stay with the vehicle if you can. Help's on the way." Tom's eyes kept drifting back to the body, the unnatural stillness of it. He had been around accidents before, but nothing like this. Something about the way the snow seemed to cling to the man's coat, to the way the cold had etched his skin, made him shiver in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. He glanced back toward the trees, and that's when he saw the footprints. Not just the ones from the man, but a series of deep, wide tracks leading back into the woods. They weren't human. The thought was instinctive, gut level, but he dismissed it. Maybe a deer? A large dog? He was freezing and tired, and the wind was picking up again, screaming through the pines. He checked his radio, but the static had worsened. He would have to stay put until backup arrived. That's when the sound started. It was faint at first, a crunching, shuffling through the snow, but then it grew louder, closer. He turned toward the woods. The tracks were moving. Something was coming out of the forest, something that did not belong. He jumped back into the truck, locking the doors and slamming the heater on high, but it did nothing to warm him. The headlights illuminated the snow, and he saw movement just beyond the edge of the beam. Something hunched, too large to be human, dragging itself through the drift. He thought he heard a whisper, a breath of cold wind carrying words he didn't understand, but it sounded like laughter too. Tom grabbed his flashlight and aimed it toward the movement. Nothing, just a shadow. He leaned closer to the window and caught a glimpse. Gray, jagged features, long limbs, the way the snow seemed to melt where it touched whatever it was. And then it stopped. Just like that. Tom's phone buzzed, finally a signal. A text from his wife. "Drive safe, love. Don't take the back road." He swallowed hard, remembering the warning. Too late now. He pressed the radio button, trying again to call dispatch. "Reynolds, you there?" "Yes." Someone. It's out here." He's static. Then a low, groaning sigh that made his stomach turn. "Tom, what the hell is that sound?" Before he could answer, the headlights flickered, the truck shuddered, and the engine cut out. He slammed his hands against the steering wheel, trying to restart it. The shadow from the woods was closer now, moving around the front of the vehicle. Tom thought about opening the door and running. but he didn't know where to go. The snow was deep, and the storm had erased all the tracks but the ones leading from the forest. And the tracks weren't just footprints, they were gouges in the earth, clawed deep into the frozen ground. He flicked the flashlight back on and saw it. It was standing at the edge of the beam, tall and thin, the kind of body that didn't make sense in the world. Long fingers, jagged teeth reflecting the light, eyes dark holes that seemed to swallow the beam. It tilted its head as if studying him, and then it laughed, a wet, gurgling sound that echoed off the trees. The truck door froze in his hands. The creature stepped back, vanished for a moment in the snow, then reappeared closer. And then another one, and another. Shadows, tall and misshapen, emerging from the tree line like they had been waiting for him all along. Tom slammed the doors, the noise startling them, and in the darkness he could see the shapes hesitating. Something about the headlights, the sound, the way he held himself, it made them pause. But not for long. The first clawed the hood, leaving deep scratches in the metal. Snow flying. Tom slammed the truck into gear, tires spinning. He didn't know where he was going, just away. The creatures kept pace on the snow, gliding or running. He couldn't tell which. By the time he reached the main road, the headlights of the town were in sight. Relief surged through him, a short-lived comfort. The storm had knocked out a few streetlights, and the town itself seemed eerily quiet. When he pulled into the parking lot of the diner, he froze. Inside, the diner was empty. Chairs overturned, mugs shattered, and on the wall a message scratched deep into the wood with long, sharp claws. "You should not have come." Tom's radio crackled again, finally. "Tom, are you there? Report." He didn't answer. He didn't move. He just stared at the message, his hands shaking, realizing that wherever he had just come from, it had followed him. Or maybe it had been waiting for him all along. They found the truck later, abandoned, tracks leading in a circle around the diner before disappearing. The snow had covered everything overnight, leaving only a few signs. Deep gouges in the asphalt, strange tracks too large for any animal, and the faint smell of iron in the air. Tom Reynolds was never found. Local rumors say the storm that year was worse than any other in memory. People spoke of shadows moving in the woods, of strange footprints around cabins, and the faint sound of laughter carried on the wind during the coldest nights. Children refused to play outside after dark. Hunters stopped going into Miller's Hollow. The power lines were repaired, but the sense of dread never left. Some say what Tom saw was the spirit of the forest, angry at humans intruding, feeding off fear and cold. Others whisper of something older, a creature that thrives in the frozen isolation, waiting for those foolish enough to drive the back roads. But no one really knows. Every winter since, when the snow comes early and thick, people remember Tom Reynolds and the night he vanished. They stay home, keep their doors locked, and pray the wind carries only the sound of the storm and not the shadows lurking just beyond the edge of the trees. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the wind howls through Marrow Creek, locals swear they hear a gurgling laugh riding over the snow, following the back roads into town, reminding everyone that some things should never be disturbed. Story the end. The wind cut through the trees like 1,000 knives, rattling the branches and sending snowflakes swirling in chaotic patterns across the abandoned logging road. Tom Harris tightened his parka around his body, shivering despite the layers. He had been driving for hours through the backwoods of northern Minnesota, far from the main highway, and the snowstorm that had started that morning was intensifying rapidly. Visibility was near zero, and the headlights of his old Ford truck barely penetrated the dense curtain of white. He had taken this route countless times, hauling logs for the small timber company he worked for. But something about this storm felt different, ominous. The snow was coming down so hard that even his truck's four-wheel drive struggled for traction. Tom slowed to a crawl, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He had planned to spend the night at the small cabin owned by his friend, Bill, but the storm had picked up faster than expected. Every few minutes he would catch glimpses of shapes in the snow, barely discernible shadows that seemed to vanish when he blinked. He shook his head, telling himself it was just a trick of the storm, just the trees playing with the light. After nearly an hour of crawling through the whiteout, Tom's truck hit something. A loud thump rattled through the chassis, and the tires skidded across an icy patch, throwing him against the seatbelt. Heart racing, he stopped the truck and jumped out into the blizzard. He could barely see a few feet in front of him. Kneeling in the snow, he searched for debris and quickly realized he had hit a large, frozen branch, or maybe a fallen tree. He cursed under his breath and went to clear it from the road. That's when he saw the footprints. They were human, or at least he thought they were. They were deep and fresh, leading off the road and disappearing into the forest. Tom frowned. It was too early in the season for hikers, especially with a storm like this. He squinted, trying to make out the shapes in the distance. The footprints stopped suddenly, as if the person had vanished. Tom shook his head, telling himself again that it was just snow covering the rest. But an unease settled over him, gnawing at his instincts. Something about the way the snow was disturbed, so deliberate, so careful, made him step back toward his truck. He climbed back in, locked the doors, and tried to focus on driving. The storm seemed endless, an unbroken wall of white. As he drove, he felt the temperature drop sharply. His breath fogged the windows instantly, and his truck's heater struggled to keep up. Then he saw it, a figure on the road, standing perfectly still, staring at him. The headlights illuminated it just long enough for Tom to register the shape. A tall man, impossibly thin, wearing tattered clothing and a hood that obscured his face. His arms hung unnaturally at his sides, stiff like branches. Tom slammed on the brakes. The figure didn't move. He rolled down the window a fraction, hoping to hear or see some sign of life, but there was nothing, only the wind and the howl of the storm. Heart hammering, he shifted into reverse, backing up carefully, but when he glanced again, the figure was gone. No footprints, no sign of disturbance in the snow. It was as if it had never been there. Tom's rational mind screamed at him. Maybe hallucination, maybe frostbite, but a deep, primal fear settled in his chest. He forced himself to keep moving, inching the truck forward at a snail's pace. That's when the radio crackled. Static at first, then a voice, faint and distorted. "Tom, help, cold, can't see." The words were broken, warped by interference, but he recognized the voice. His stomach dropped. It was Bill. Tom slammed the truck into park. "Bill?" he yelled into the storm, hoping the wind hadn't swallowed his voice. The radio crackled again, repeating the same fragmented message. The cabin, he had to get to the cabin. Grabbing the emergency pack from the back seat, he sprinted through the snow, visibility near zero. Every step was a battle. The wind tore at his face, freezing the exposed skin instantly. Hours, or maybe minutes, time lost all meaning in the storm. Later, he stumbled onto the cabin. The door was ajar, swinging slightly with the wind. Tom's heart pounded in his ears as he pushed it open. Inside, the place was empty. No sign of Bill, no tracks leading out. Only the fire pit, cold and covered in snow from the broken window above. Then he heard it. A scraping sound, low and deliberate, coming from the far corner of the cabin. Tom flicked on his flashlight. The beam trembled as he held it, illuminating the corner slowly. At first he saw nothing, only shadows dancing across the walls. Then, moving with impossible slowness, a figure emerged. Tall, skeletal, and wrapped in rags, just like the man on the road. But the worst part wasn't the figure itself, it was the face. Bill's face. Twisted, pale, eyes frozen wide, lips forming a silent scream. Tom stumbled back, tripping over the threshold. The flashlight slipped from his hands, clattering across the floor and rolling under the table. Darkness enveloped him. The figure stepped forward, impossibly fast now, gliding over the floorboards without making a sound. Tom scrambled to his feet and ran out the back door, the snowstorm swallowing him instantly. The world became a white void. He ran blindly, lungs burning until he could run no more. Collapsing into a drift, he pressed his face into the snow, hoping the storm would hide him. The scraping sound followed, circling him, relentless. Whimpering, he covered his head, praying for it to end. Hours, or maybe days later, he awoke to silence. The sun was just rising, weak and pale, revealing a world frozen in ice. Tom dragged himself back to the road, following the tracks of his truck. It was gone. Only the faintest outline in the snow remained, half buried by drifted snow. He made it back to town by nightfall, ragged, frostbitten, and incoherent. When he tried to tell anyone what happened, no one believed him. Search parties went to the cabin. There was no sign of Bill. No tracks, no disturbance, nothing. The cabin looked as if it had been abandoned for decades. Months later, Tom tried to move on, but the memories haunted him. The nightmares were worse than anything the storm could have inflicted. And then the phone calls started. At first, a crackle of static, then faint whispering, "Tom, help, cold." Always the same broken voice, always ending abruptly. Every night, the calls came, no matter how far he traveled. One particularly bitter winter, Tom decided to return to northern Minnesota to face whatever had claimed his friend and tormented him. He rented a 4x4, packed supplies, and followed the logging roads back into the woods. The snow had fallen heavier than ever, blanketing the forest in a thick, blinding white. When he reached the spot where the road had gone, his heart stopped. There were footprints, not fresh, they were old, frozen into the ice, but they were leading directly toward him. And at the center of the tracks, standing still, was the same figure he had seen before. Tall, thin, hooded, with Bill's face. Tom froze, paralyzed. The figure didn't move. It didn't even seem aware of the storm raging around it. Then, impossibly, it tilted its head as if examining him, and the whisper came, not through a radio, not through a phone, but directly inside his mind. "Tom, join. Cold, forever." The snowstorm intensified and the figure advanced. Tom turned the truck around and floored the accelerator, tires spinning on ice. He drove until the woods gave way to highway, until the storm thinned and lights of civilization pierced the blizzard. But even then, he knew it hadn't ended. Sometimes when the wind howled at night, he could hear scraping across the roof, shadows moving at the edge of his vision, and a whisper just beyond comprehension calling his name. Tom never went back into the northern woods. He never told anyone the full story. But sometimes when winter comes early and the snow falls heavier than it should, he can't help but remember. He can see the footprints in the snow, can hear Bill's voice in the static, and he knows with a bone-deep certainty that whatever waits in the storm is patient, eternal, and always just outside the light. Story, the end. The wind howled through the pines, carrying the bitter chill of early December across the Colorado mountains. Snow had been falling steadily for hours, coating everything in a thick white blanket. The town of Westbridge was small and isolated, a handful of houses huddled along the valley floor, roads disappearing under the weight of the snow. Most of the residents were used to winter storms, but that night there was an uneasy tension in the air. Something about the storm felt different, heavier, as if it was pressing down on the town itself. Ben Carter, a local logger, was driving home from a late shift in the woods. His pickup truck groaned under the snow, tires struggling to grip the ice-slicked road. Visibility was nearly zero, the headlights barely cutting through the swirling white. He knew the roads well, but even familiarity couldn't chase away the sense of dread creeping up his spine. He caught a glimpse of a figure on the side of the road, barely distinguishable through the snow, a man, or maybe a child, waving desperately. He slowed, squinting, but when he got closer, the figure was gone. Snow drifted across the roadside, undisturbed, as if no one had ever been there. Shaking off the unease, Ben continued home, his cabin a small dot of warmth in the storm. Inside, the fireplace crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls. His dog, a border collie named Max, sniffed the air nervously. Ben tried to ignore the feeling that something was watching him, some unexplainable presence lurking just beyond the frosted windows. He chalked it up to the storm and the long drive. Across town, Emily and her brother Jake were stranded in their car on the winding road that led to their parents' house. They had been returning from a weekend trip when the snow started coming down too fast to continue. Jake tried the radio, hoping for a weather update, but all they got was static. Hours passed and the temperature dropped. Emily tried to stay calm, wrapping herself in blankets, but Jake's unease was contagious. Every shadow cast by the headlights seemed to move, shapes forming in the drifting snow like hands reaching for them. Around midnight, the town's emergency services received scattered calls from drivers trapped on the roads. Rescue teams had to navigate through the storm with snowmobiles, chains, and flashlights, but visibility was almost non-existent. One of the teams, led by a seasoned officer named Harris, spotted something strange while approaching the Carter cabin. Footprints led away from the road deep into the woods, stopping abruptly near a frozen creek. The tracks didn't make sense. Some were large, some small, as if two beings of vastly different sizes had walked together. And then there were the markings between the prints, scratches across the snow that seemed too deliberate to be natural. Ben was unaware of any of this as he tried to sleep, but Max growled low in his throat, ears pinned back. In the dark corner of the living room, the shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, twisting toward him. Ben rubbed his eyes, thinking exhaustion was playing tricks on him, but the sensation persisted. He heard the faint sound of something dragging across the floor upstairs. He grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the staircase. The light revealed nothing but the dust motes dancing in the air, yet the dragging sound continued, coming closer now, as if circling him. Meanwhile, Emily and Jake's car began to shake violently. Something was hitting the vehicle from outside, thumps and scraping noises against the metal roof. Jake threw the door open and peered out into the blizzard. The snow was falling too thickly to see more than a few feet ahead, yet he caught a glimpse of a shadow moving with an unnatural gait, darting between trees. Panic set in. They tried the heater, but it sputtered and died, leaving them in the cold, deafening silence, except for the storm and the things moving just beyond their sight. Harris and his team, searching for stranded residents, stumbled upon a scene that would haunt them forever. Near the creek, a set of footprints led to the edge of the frozen water and then disappeared entirely. The snow around the area was trampled and clawed, and strange grooves were carved into the ice, as if something with long claws had struggled to get out or had tried to escape. The officers called for backup, but by the time reinforcements arrived, the snowstorm had erased almost all evidence, leaving only a sense of wrongness, like the air itself was tainted. Back at Ben's cabin, Max began barking frantically. The shadows in the room shifted again, and for a brief moment, Ben thought he saw a pair of glowing eyes staring at him from the doorway. Heart pounding, he swung the flashlight toward the figure, but it was gone. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, his breath visible in sharp clouds. The sense of being watched intensified. Then came the whispers, low, unintelligible, seemingly coming from the walls themselves. Ben stumbled back, tripping over a chair, and the whispers rose to an almost human shriek. Emily and Jake, desperate and freezing, finally decided to leave the car and try to walk toward the faint lights of a distant cabin. Each step was a struggle, snow swallowing their legs. Shapes moved in the storm around them, quick flashes at the edge of their vision. Every so often, a shadow would appear directly in front of them, standing perfectly still for a heartbeat, then vanish when they looked away. Jake fell, and when he looked up, Emily was gone. A scream tore through the storm, but it was muffled almost instantly by the howling wind. Harris's team received frantic radio calls from other residents reporting strange occurrences. Lights flickered in houses with no power, footprints appeared on rooftops, and doors locked from the inside refused to open. One family called to report that a figure had been seen staring in their windows, tall, thin, and impossibly pale, with limbs that seemed to bend in the wrong direction. By the time officers reached the house, the family had vanished, leaving only the front door ajar and the snow trampled around the porch. Ben tried to leave his cabin, but found the storm had become impenetrable. The trees around his property groaned under the weight of snow, but there were other sounds mixed in, scratches, thumps, and that low, wet, dragging sound that made his stomach turn. Max whimpered, pressed against his leg, refusing to move. Ben realized the snow outside the windows was moving, sloughing off in slow slides, forming patterns like letters in a language he couldn't understand. By dawn, the town was silent. The storm had stopped as suddenly as it began, leaving the streets coated in a thick, pristine layer of snow. Emergency crews ventured out, searching for survivors. Some houses were found empty, doors locked from the inside, cars abandoned in odd positions, engines still running, half buried. Footprints led into the woods and never returned. A few residents were discovered, wandering in a daze, muttering about figures that walked alongside them, whispers that promised pain, cold that wasn't from the snow. Ben's cabin was found intact, Max lying dead on the floor, eyes wide in terror. Ben himself was gone, and no footprints led away from the house. The only trace of him was a series of scratches on the walls, deep and frantic, as if something had tried to claw its way out from the inside. Emily and Jake were never found, though a single boot was recovered near the creek. Residents began to avoid the area entirely. leaving Westbridge mostly abandoned, a ghost town hidden beneath the snow. Over the years, hikers and travelers reported strange occurrences along the old roads leading into the mountains, shadows moving against the wind, footprints appearing in fresh snow only to vanish without a trace, and faint whispers carried across the valleys in the dead of winter. Some said the figures were survivors, others that they were something else entirely, creatures born from the storm, waiting in the cold to claim anyone foolish enough to be out after dark. Locals tell the story quietly, warning newcomers to never venture into the woods during a blizzard and to never stop if they see someone standing on the roadside. They speak of the cold that isn't just cold, the snow that seems to shift to trap you, and the eyes that watch from beyond the trees. And if you're unlucky enough to be caught in the heart of the storm, some say you'll hear the whispers first, and if you listen too closely, you'll disappear like so many before you, leaving only a set of footprints that lead nowhere and the soft scrape of claws across the ice. Even today, when the first snow falls in Westbridge, the townspeople shutter their windows and huddle by the fire. The wind brings with it more than just frost. It carries a memory, a warning, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the snow, pacing slowly, endlessly, just beyond sight. Story the end. The snow had been falling steadily for days, the kind that blankets everything in a suffocating, almost otherworldly silence. The town of Pine Hollow, tucked deep into the Appalachian Mountains, was used to harsh winters, but this year was different. Temperatures had plunged well below zero, and the snow was heavier than anyone could remember. Roads were treacherous, and the small community, normally bustling with tourists drawn to its winter lodges, was nearly deserted. Only the locals braved the cold, going about their business with a wary respect for the storm. Jake Carson had lived in Pine Hollow all his life. He ran a small hardware store and was known for being practical, calm, and unflappable. But even Jake felt a prickling unease that December morning as he shoveled the snow outside his shop. The wind carried a strange metallic tang, and the flakes seemed unusually large, clinging to his coat like wet wool. He paused, listening, and realized the usual distant howl of the wind had been joined by something else. Faint, irregular footsteps crunching across the freshly fallen snow. At first he thought it was a neighbor, perhaps crossing the street to check on the town's aging water pump. But when he squinted into the whiteness, he saw no one. The snowstorm made visibility near zero, but the sound of those footsteps continued, soft yet deliberate, coming closer, then stopping abruptly. He shook his head and muttered to himself that his imagination was getting the better of him. Yet a gnawing feeling in his gut told him something was wrong. The first signs of trouble came that afternoon when his neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, knocked on his door. She was a small, frail woman with hair as white as the snow outside, and her eyes were wide with fear. "Jake, it's the Petersons," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They went out yesterday to check the generator at the cabin, and they haven't come back." Jake frowned. The Petersons' cabin was only a few miles up the ridge, normally a short trek through the snow, but the blizzard made roads nearly impassable. He nodded, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. "Don't worry, Mrs. Holloway. I'll check it out. I've been through worse storms than this." But as he grabbed his coat and snow boots, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm itself was wrong. The air was heavier, thicker, almost oppressive. He could hear the wind moaning through the trees in a way that didn't sound natural. By the time Jake reached the Peterson cabin, the storm had intensified. The snow clung to his eyelashes, freezing them into brittle spikes. The cabin sat half buried under drifts, the roof sagging under the weight. The door was ajar, and a thin trail of smoke escaped the chimney, faint and sickly. He stepped inside cautiously, calling out, "Tom? Linda?" His voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the thick silence of the storm. The cabin was empty. Chairs were overturned, and a half-eaten meal sat on the table, untouched and frost-covered. Jake's heart began to race. The Petersons weren't outside. They hadn't gone for a walk. Something had happened, and he couldn't shake the sense that they hadn't left willingly. He moved to the back of the cabin, where the bedrooms were, and found signs of struggle, claw marks on the walls, bedding torn and scattered. Panic surged through him. This wasn't a simple accident or a case of being lost in the storm. Whatever had come for the Petersons had been inside their home. Jake knew he needed backup. He raced back to town through the blinding snow, his mind churning with dread. By the time he reached the hardware store, the rest of the town was already on edge. Phones were down due to the storm, and word spread quickly about the missing family. A search party formed, armed with flashlights, snowmobiles, and whatever gear they could find. They set out at night, the storm still raging. Visibility was near zero, and the wind tore at their faces like knives. Jake led the way to the Peterson cabin, then further up the ridge where the snow was untouched and the silence was absolute. The tracks were there at first, boots sinking into the snow, but soon they became impossible to follow. The snow seemed to erase everything in minutes, leaving only a pristine, eerie whiteness. Hours passed, and the search party found nothing, no footprints, no sign of the Petersons, nothing but snow and the occasional broken branch. Exhausted and chilled to the bone, they returned to town, hoping to regroup in the morning. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time the wind shifted, he thought he saw figures moving just beyond the range of the flashlight beams. That night, the storm reached its peak. Pine Hollow was entirely cut off. Power lines snapped under the weight of ice, and the town fell into darkness. Jake huddled in his small hardware store with Mrs. Holloway and a few others who couldn't get home. Outside, the wind screamed like a living thing, and every few minutes there was a sound that froze the blood in their veins. Footsteps crunching in the snow around the building, circling them, stopping, then starting again. By morning, the storm had finally abated. The townspeople ventured out cautiously, half expecting to find their friends and neighbors gone. The Peterson cabin was empty, just as they had feared. But more alarming were the tracks leading away from it. Not human footprints, but something larger, deeper, and strangely irregular. The prints meandered toward the mountains, then disappeared into the forest. Over the next few days, more disappearances occurred. People who had gone out to check on relatives or the roads never returned. Search parties found cabins ransacked, belongings scattered, and in some cases strange symbols carved into trees and doors, symbols no one in Pine Hollow had ever seen. Panic spread, and the town began to empty as families fled, leaving homes and businesses behind. Jake refused to leave. He barricaded himself in his store, stocking up on food and firewood, but the footsteps outside continued, always circling, never approaching directly, yet never leaving. Sometimes he thought he saw shadows moving past the windows, tall, gaunt figures that seemed to glide over the snow rather than walk. He would step outside in the daytime, calling out, but there was nothing there, only the endless white. Then, one night, the snow stopped and a cold, unnatural fog rolled in. Jake stepped outside, drawn by a compulsion he didn't understand, and saw them. Dozens of figures emerging from the fog, moving silently, eyes glowing faintly red. They didn't speak, didn't approach aggressively at first. They just watched. And in that moment, Jake understood. Whatever had taken the Petersons, whatever had been stalking the town, wasn't human. The figures didn't advance, but the knowledge of their presence was enough. Panic clawed at him as he ran back inside, locking the door, but he knew the truth. They were patient. They didn't need to attack immediately. The storm, the snow, the cold, it had been their ally, a way to isolate and hunt. By the end of that week, Pine Hollow was nearly deserted. Jake was one of the last few left, huddled in his store with enough supplies to last. The footsteps never stopped, even when the fog lifted and the sky cleared. Sometimes he swore he could hear whispering in the wind, as though the snow itself was trying to communicate. And then the final horror came. One evening, as Jake peered through the frost-covered windows, he saw a single figure standing in the town square. It was human-shaped, but impossibly tall, limbs too long, moving in a jerky, unnatural rhythm. Its eyes glowed red, and it raised a hand toward him. Jake froze, heart pounding, and in that instant he realized the truth. The storm had passed, but whatever had come with it was still here, waiting, watching, patient. No one ever saw Jake again. When authorities eventually came through Pine Hollow weeks later, they found the town empty. Cabins stood half buried in snow, stores untouched, doors hanging open. There were no signs of struggle, no bodies, just the deep, undisturbed snow and a silence so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. People who returned later to rebuild claimed that on clear winter nights, when the wind blew just right, They could hear footsteps in the snow, circling, patient, and unending. They said it was best never to stay in Pine Hollow during a blizzard. Some nights, the snow brings them back, the watchers in the cold, moving silently among the drifts, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to wander too far. The first snow had fallen in early November that year, thicker than anyone could remember. The small town of Willow Creek, nestled in the Appalachian foothills of Pennsylvania, looked like it had been frozen in time, white, silent, and oppressive. People said winters here were harsh, but that year it seemed the cold had a weight of its own, pressing down on the rooftops and sidewalks like an invisible hand. Ethan Carter had lived in Willow Creek all his life. A man in his late 20s, tall and wiry, with calloused hands from years of working at the local sawmill, he didn't scare easily. But that winter, even he felt something off. The first night he noticed it was just after Thanksgiving. He was driving home from the mill late, the roads slick and treacherous, when he saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest along Route 42. A woman, pale as snow, motionless. Her hair was dark, falling in wet tangles over her shoulders. He thought about stopping, but the air was heavy and a shiver ran down his spine. When he glanced back a moment later, she was gone. By Christmas, the weather had turned from cold to brutal snow. Snow piled high against doors and windows. The town's power lines groaned under the weight, and for a week, many families, including Ethan's, had to live without electricity. People lit candles, bundled up in blankets, and told stories to keep their minds off the freezing chill. It was during one of these nights that things got worse. Ethan had a neighbor, Mrs. Halloway, an elderly woman who lived alone a few houses down. She was known for being eccentric but harmless, always talking about spirits and old Appalachian legends. That night, Ethan had gone over to check on her after seeing smoke curling strangely from her chimney. When he knocked, she opened the door, pale and trembling. "They're coming," she whispered, gripping his arm. "Don't go out tonight." "What are you talking about, Mrs. Halloway?" Ethan asked, his teeth chattering. "The snow isn't natural this year," she said. Her eyes darted to the window. "The mountain, it's awake." Ethan forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow. "It's just snow. It's winter." But the unease in the room was palpable. That night, as Ethan drove home, he thought he saw strange shapes moving in the snow, shadowy forms slipping between trees, too fast to be human, too deliberate to be animals. By New Year's Eve, Willow Creek was nearly cut off from the rest of the world. Roads were buried under 10 feet of snow in places, and the town had become an isolated, frozen prison. People reported missing pets, sudden livestock deaths, and eerie, untraceable noises in the woods. It was as if the forest itself had grown restless. Ethan's job at the sawmill kept him occupied, but he was increasingly unsettled. One evening, while stacking logs in the mill's storage yard, he heard whispers carried by the wind. Low, murmuring, almost like voices speaking from beneath the snow. At first, he thought it was his imagination. Then he saw footprints, dozens of them, crisscrossing the yard. But the snow had been undisturbed just hours before. The prints were human-sized, but the spacing and direction made no sense. They looped, doubled back, vanished, and reappeared. He began to notice other things, too. Windows in his house would frost over from the inside, forming shapes, figures that seemed to be staring at him. Doors he swore he locked would be slightly ajar in the morning. And sometimes he could hear soft knocks on the walls, not like the house settling, but deliberate, rhythmic, almost like someone or something was trying to get in. The worst came on the night of January 3rd. Ethan had gone to bed early, exhausted from the cold and the constant snow clearing, when he was awoken by a sound that made his blood run cold, scratching at the window. At first, he froze, thinking maybe it was a branch, but the sound persisted, slow and deliberate. He crept to the window and pulled back the curtain. The snow outside had shifted, forming a small mound that wasn't there before, and atop it stood the figure again, the woman from the road, her dark hair plastered to her face, her eyes gleaming black in the dim moonlight. Ethan stumbled back. He wanted to run, to call someone, but his phone had no signal and he was alone. When he looked back, she was gone. That night, sleep didn't come. Around 2 a.m., he heard something else. Footsteps in the snow outside, circling the house, crunching with terrifying precision. They stopped at the back door. He could hear breathing. Heavy, ragged. He grabbed a flashlight and flung open the door, shining the beam into the white void. There was nothing, just the snow, endless and pristine. Yet he knew he wasn't alone. Over the next few days, more townsfolk began reporting strange sightings. A man walking his dog swore he saw children playing in the snow, but when he approached, there was nothing there. Another neighbor saw a car buried in a snowdrift, headlights blinking, though it hadn't been driven for months. Rumors of the Pale Ones began to circulate. People whispered about old legends, spirits of the lost trapped in snow, awakened by harsh winters, drawn to the living to escape their frozen prisons. Ethan tried to dismiss it all, focusing on survival. He spent his days shoveling paths, fetching firewood, and checking on neighbors. But at night, the whispering voices returned. They came through the walls, through the snow, through the wind. He began to dream of them. Pale figures crawling from the trees, dragging themselves across the ice, eyes empty yet filled with longing. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day clearing snow, he decided to go for a walk to clear his head. The sun was low and the world was a blinding white. He followed a familiar path through the woods behind his house, but soon realized he had wandered farther than he intended. The snow muffled his steps, and the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. That's when he saw them, dozens of figures, crouching, hidden in the snow. Their faces were pale, their eyes black voids, and they watched him silently. Ethan's heart pounded. He turned to run but stumbled, falling into a drift. When he looked up, they were closer. He scrambled to his feet, but the forest had shifted. Trees that were there before weren't. Snowdrifts had changed shape. It was as if the land itself was alive, reshaping to trap him. He ran blindly, branches whipping his face, snow biting his skin. The whispers rose to a chorus, surrounding him, pressing into his mind. Panic drove him onward until finally, exhausted and frozen, he collapsed against a tree. Through the veil of white, he saw the woman from the road again. She knelt beside him. "Follow," she whispered. Her voice was hollow but insistent. Instinctively, he did. The figures parted, forming a path through the snow. He ran as fast as he could, guided by her. Finally, the forest thinned, and he saw the glow of Willow Creek in the distance. But as he approached, he realized something horrifying. The town was silent. The houses were intact, but there was no movement. No smoke rose from chimneys, no lights flickered. It was as if the town itself had been swallowed by the snow. Then he heard it, the whispers again, but closer this time, emanating from the very ground. The snow shifted, and pale faces began to emerge, pressing against windows, doors, every surface. They stared at him, unblinking, endless. And in the center, the woman knelt, smiling. Ethan ran past her, ignoring the cold that seemed to seep into his bones, ignoring the terror that gripped his chest. He ran toward what he hoped was the edge of town, hoping for something, anything, to be real. But the forest seemed infinite, the snow endless, and always the whispering, calling, reaching. By the time the rescue teams arrived days later, when the storm finally broke, there was no sign of Ethan, only his footprints leading into the woods and then, abruptly, ending. Locals say sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees on winter nights, you can hear a lone voice calling for help, mingling with a chorus of whispers, and see dark shapes moving just beyond the tree line. Willow Creek is still there, still buried under snow each winter, but the town is quieter now. People speak less of the missing, more of avoiding the woods once the first heavy snow falls. They say that some winters the mountain is awake, and if you wander too far, if you see the Pale Ones, you may never come back. No one knows what Ethan saw or what drew him into the forest that night. Some say he was taken by spirits of the frozen, others that the snow itself claimed him. But those who live there now, who shovel paths through drifts and peer into the darkened woods, all feel it. That oppressive weight, the sense that the land is watching, waiting, and that sometimes when the snow falls too thick, you are not alone. Story the end. The wind had been howling since early morning, a relentless force that scraped the edges of the small town of Marrow Creek. Snow had begun falling heavily by mid-afternoon, thick flakes that blanketed the streets and swallowed sound. By the time night fell, the town was almost unrecognizable, a ghostly world of white. Streetlights cast weak halos in the storm, their beams fading into the swirling snow. It was the kind of night where even the bravest people stayed indoors, huddled against the cold and the dark. Jonah and his brother Marcus weren't those people. They had grown up on the outskirts of town, and the snow had always been an invitation, a playground. But this winter was different. Reports of missing hikers and a string of car accidents on the back roads had made the local news. Old-timers whispered about storms that came with more than just wind, storms that carried something unseen, something hungry. Jonah didn't believe in ghost stories or old warnings, but even he felt uneasy as he and Marcus loaded the old snowmobile into the driveway. "Maybe we shouldn't go tonight," Marcus said, his voice tight. He wasn't usually the cautious one, but something about the wind made his teeth chatter. Jonah laughed. "Don't be a wimp. We'll stick to the woods by Miller's Creek. Nothing bad ever happens there, just trees, snow, and us." They had been racing through those woods since they were kids, weaving between trees and jumping over frozen streams. The thrill was addictive, and tonight, fueled by too much coffee and cabin fever, Jonah had a reckless energy. He revved the snowmobile, the engine growling against the storm. The woods were a maze in the snow. Familiar trails were hidden beneath thick drifts, and even landmarks disappeared under the white. The brothers pressed on, laughing at first, throwing snow at each other, the cold biting their cheeks. But as they went deeper, the laughter faded. Trees seemed to close in around them, their skeletal branches scratching at the sky. The wind wasn't just cold. It seemed alive, carrying whispers that sounded almost like voices. Jonah dismissed it at first as the wind playing tricks, but Marcus froze, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Jonah said, scanning the trees. "Talking. I think someone's out here." Jonah shook his head. "It's just the wind." They moved on, but the sense of being watched only grew. Shadows flitted at the edges of their vision, shapes that disappeared when they tried to focus on them. Jonah tried to keep the mood light, making jokes, but even he couldn't ignore the feeling that they weren't alone. By the time they reached Miller's Creek, the snow was waist deep. The creek itself was frozen over, its surface slick and treacherous. They stopped to catch their breath, leaning on the snowmobile. Marcus pointed downstream where a figure seemed to be moving slowly, hunched against the storm. "Someone's out there," Marcus whispered. Jonah squinted. The figure was tall, impossibly still, and pale against the dark forest behind it. When it turned its head toward them, Jonah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the snow. The face was wrong. Not human. Too sharp, too thin, with dark eyes that reflected the light like black ice. Jonah grabbed Marcus's arm. "We're leaving. Now." They turned the snowmobile around, but the engine sputtered and died. Jonah cursed, pounding the dashboard. He tried to restart it, but it was no use. The wind howled around them, louder now, and that figure was moving closer, gliding over the snow as if it didn't belong to the world. Marcus's voice trembled. "Jonah, it's coming." Panic set in. They grabbed what supplies they could and started running through the snow, the figure gliding silently behind them. Every time they looked back, it was closer, moving with a speed that defied reason. Jonah stumbled, cutting his hands on the ice, but Marcus pulled him up. They ran until their lungs burned, until the snow was so deep it was exhausting just to lift their legs. Finally, they saw the edge of the woods, the dim lights of the town in the distance. Relief surged through them. They were almost safe. But when they glanced back, the figure was gone. Just gone. They didn't speak until they reached Jonah's house, shivering and drenched. Inside, the heat was welcome, the lights familiar. Jonah locked the doors and windows, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the siding made him jump. That night, Jonah dreamed of the figure. It was standing over him, its black eyes staring into his own. He woke in a cold sweat, certain that it had been in the room. Marcus was awake too, staring at the ceiling. "I saw it again," Marcus whispered, "standing in my room." Over the next few days, things got worse. The storm didn't let up. Reports came in of more missing people, hikers, drivers, even a family that had been stranded on a remote road. All of them vanished without a trace, as if the snow itself had swallowed them. Jonah and Marcus avoided the woods entirely, but every time they looked out the window, they thought they saw the same pale figure moving just beyond the tree line, always watching. One night, Jonah couldn't sleep. He looked out at the backyard and saw footprints in the fresh snow, large, elongated prints that led from the woods to the edge of the yard and stopped at the window. He swallowed hard, feeling the cold grip of fear. Marcus woke when he heard the noise, and together they saw the shadows moving in the snow. Shapes that weren't quite human, eyes that glinted in the dim light. Their parents dismissed it as imagination, blaming the stress of the storm, but Jonah and Marcus knew the truth. Something had come with the winter, something that didn't belong to the world they knew. They barricaded themselves in the house for days, listening to the storm and the whispers outside. Then, one morning, the snow stopped. The sun barely rose over the horizon, pale and weak, but the woods seemed different, silent. Jonah convinced Marcus to help him check the snowmobile, hoping to regain a sense of normalcy. They trudged through the deep drifts, but when they reached the spot where they had stopped at Miller's Creek, something made their blood run cold. The snow around the creek was disturbed, huge gouges in the ice, as if something massive had been moving beneath it. And all around, the prints were there, hundreds of them, leading from the creek toward the town. And at the center of them all, the figure stood, watching, pale and sharp, its black eyes reflecting the morning light. Jonah froze. Marcus whispered something, but the wind carried the words away. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement that made Jonah's heart pound. Then it began to glide forward, not running, not walking, but gliding across the snow, and with each movement, the prints multiplied. Jonah and Marcus turned and ran, the snowmobile useless once again, as the figure followed silently, inexorably. By the time they reached town, they were covered in snow and bloodied from falls, but the streets were empty. Not a single person in sight, though lights were on in windows. Doors were locked. Then they heard it, the low scraping sound of nails across wood from house to house coming closer. They sprinted to their own house, slamming the door behind them. Days passed. They didn't sleep, ate only what they had, listening to the sounds outside. Then the first search parties arrived, people from nearby towns looking for the missing. Jonah and Marcus tried to tell them, but when they led the rescuers into the woods, nothing was there. No tracks, no gouges, no figure, just the snow, pristine and undisturbed. Authorities chalked it up to the storm and overactive imaginations. The missing people were never found. Jonah and Marcus left Merrow Creek the following spring, never to return. They moved hundreds of miles away, trying to forget, but the memory stayed. Every winter when the wind howls and the snow falls, Jonah feels it. The eyes, the gliding presence, the way the storm can swallow a person whole without a trace. He never goes out when the snow falls, and he never ventures into the woods. But sometimes, late at night, he swears he sees those elongated prints forming at the edge of the snow, leading straight to his door. The world tells him it's impossible. Logic says it can't exist, but Jonah knows better. He knows that winter can bring more than cold and snow. It can bring the unspeakable, the things that watch from the edges of your vision, waiting for the storm to claim you. And he knows deep down that one day, if he isn't careful, it will. Story the end. The wind had been howling for hours, driving the snow against the windows of the old farmhouse like jagged knives. It was early January, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. Jake and his younger sister Lila huddled by the fireplace, trying to keep warm. Their parents had gone to town that morning, promising to return by nightfall, but the blizzard had slowed everything to a crawl. Snow had already piled so high against the front door that it seemed welded shut. Jake checked his phone for the 100th time. No signal, no service, nothing. Just a dead battery icon staring back at him, mocking. Lila was quiet, clutching the old quilt their grandmother had made. Her blue eyes were wide and restless, watching the shadows flicker on the walls from the firelight. "Jake," she whispered, "do you think they'll be okay?" "They'll be fine," he said, not though his own voice trembled. "The roads are just bad. They'll get here." But even as he said it, the thought gnawed at him. What if they didn't? The storm was relentless, and the isolation of the farmhouse, tucked away on the edge of the woods in rural Vermont, was complete. It wasn't the first time the snow had trapped them, but this storm was worse. The wind sounded almost alive, a low growl that rattled the windows and made the floorboards groan. By late afternoon, the fire had burned low. Jake tried to light the old oil lamps, but the matches were damp, and the wick in the lamp in the corner refused to catch. Darkness crept across the room, turning the familiar walls into something strange and oppressive. "That shadow," Lila whispered suddenly, pointing at the far corner. Jake squinted. At first, he thought it was just the uneven light of the fire, but then he saw it move. A figure, tall and dark, almost human in shape, yet its movements were wrong, jerky, unnatural. He shook his head. It's just your imagination. Lila didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the figure, and she was trembling. The shadows stretched as the firelight flickered. The sound of something scratching, tiny, persistent, came from the walls. Probably a tree branch, Jake said. His voice sounded hollow, even to him. But he knew the scratching wasn't outside, it was inside. Somewhere in the walls, something moved. By evening, the storm had become a white wall outside. Visibility was zero. The isolation was complete. Jake tried to keep Lila occupied, telling her stories and pretending everything was normal, but he could feel the tension in the air, thick and choking. Then came the first scream. It was faint, distant, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. Jake froze. Lila clutched his arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "I think it's just the wind," he said, but he didn't believe it. The sound grew, a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from the woods surrounding the farmhouse. Jake grabbed a flashlight and tried to look outside, but the snow was blinding, swirling so thickly that he couldn't see more than a few feet. And then, through the blur of white, he saw something. Footprints, deep and wide, appearing in the snow. Not his parents, not any animal he recognized. They moved closer to the house, slow, deliberate. The scratching inside grew louder. The shadow in the corner shifted, no longer confined to the walls, but moving toward the center of the room. Jake's heart pounded. He grabbed an old baseball bat from the corner, holding it tight. Lila's small hands gripped his jacket. Suddenly, the lights of the old farmhouse flickered and went out completely. Darkness swallowed them. Jake swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the black, and froze. The figure was there, just a few feet away. It was tall, impossibly thin, its face featureless like smooth white porcelain. Its limbs were too long, bending in ways they shouldn't. Lila screamed. "Stay back!" Jake shouted, swinging the bat. The figure didn't flinch. It just moved closer, gliding rather than walking, soundless now. The air grew colder, the fire in the hearth dimmed as though the darkness was sucking it away. Then the scratching came from above, the ceiling like claws on wood. Dust fell from the beams. Something heavy landed upstairs. Jake realized with horror that the attic door, always locked, was now open. "It wants us," Lila whispered, her voice shaking. "We're not going anywhere," Jake said, trying to sound brave, but he knew they couldn't outrun whatever this was. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and in this blizzard, even if someone came, it would be too late. The figure moved closer, tilting its head as if studying them. Then it vanished, just like that, leaving an oppressive silence behind. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, pulsing thrum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Hours passed. They stayed huddled together, listening. Occasionally, Jake thought he saw shapes moving outside the frosted windows, silhouettes against the white just beyond recognition. He wanted to believe it was the storm, but his gut told him otherwise. Around midnight, the front door creaked open. They didn't hear the snow, didn't feel the cold. They only heard it. A slow, deliberate step across the threshold. "Mom? Dad?" Jake called, his voice cracking. No answer. The step came closer. Another and another. Then silence. Jake's flashlight flickered and went out. Total darkness. Lila whimpered. He swung the bat blindly. Something cold and wet brushed his arm. He screamed. Lila screamed. The shadows seemed to pour into the room, thickening, suffocating. The air smelled of something rotten, like frozen meat left in the snow too long. He felt hands, too many hands, grasping at him. They were cold, impossibly cold, biting at his skin. He swung the bat again, hitting something solid, and the creature let out a sound. It wasn't a growl or a scream. It was like the creaking of 1,000 doors opening at once. Then it was gone. The storm subsided by morning. When their parents returned, the farmhouse was quiet. Too quiet. They found the front door open, snow piled up inside the entrance. Jake and Lila were nowhere to be seen. The only trace was the quilt Lila had been holding, folded neatly in the corner of the living room. The fire had burned down to ashes, and the walls were scratched, deep gouges clawed into the plaster as if something had tried to escape from inside. The neighbors who came to help said the footprints outside didn't match any known animal or human. The snow had preserved them perfectly, my life, stretching from the edge of the woods to the front porch and stopping abruptly. No footprints led away. The farmhouse was abandoned after that winter. Some say the siblings disappeared into the storm, taken by whatever haunted the shadows. Others say they're still inside, trapped somewhere between the walls and the attic, waiting for the next blizzard to cover their cries. Locals avoid the place now. Even in the dead of winter, when the wind rattles the windows, they say you can hear the scratching. And sometimes, if you're foolish enough to get close, the faint whisper of a little girl calling for her brother. Jake and Lila were never found. And on those long, frozen nights, when the snow piles high and the wind howls like a living thing, the farmhouse stands silently, holding the echoes of screams and the darkness that came for them. Story, the end. The storm had been coming for days, but no one expected it to hit as hard as it did. In the small town of Bemidji, Minnesota, the locals were used to harsh winters, but the news had warned of a blizzard that would rival anything in living memory. Roads were treacherous, temperatures plummeted, and visibility dropped to near zero. For most people, that meant staying indoors, huddled under blankets, but for Jake Thornton, a 28-year-old construction worker, it meant driving. Jake had taken on a short-term contract fixing electrical lines in a remote part of the county. The job had seemed simple enough when he started that morning, replace a transformer along a back road near the forest. But by mid-afternoon, the snow began to fall in heavy sheets. He had finished the repair and was eager to head back to town, imagining a warm shower and a hot cup of coffee. His pickup truck, a rugged Ford F-250 with four-wheel drive, was his only lifeline in the growing whiteout. The road he drove was narrow, winding through dense pine forest, and the snow fell so thick that the road lines were invisible. Jake slowed down, his hands tight on the steering wheel, straining to see any signs of the road ahead. The radio, usually full of chatter, had gone dead under the storm's interference, leaving only static. Hours seemed to stretch like days as he navigated the blizzard. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. He slammed on the brakes, heart thudding. A figure had appeared in the middle of the road, tall and gaunt, shrouded in dark clothing. For a split second, he thought it was a hunter or a stranded traveler, but the figure didn't move to the side. It just stood there, frozen in place. Jake's mind raced. He honked the horn, revved the engine, tried to scare it away. Nothing, and then the figure stepped forward. Or maybe it didn't. His brain couldn't make sense of it. By the time he realized the figure was gone, he was already driving again, adrenaline pumping through his veins. As he drove further into the storm, the temperature in the truck began dropping rapidly, even though the heater was on full blast. He looked down at the dashboard. The thermometer read -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost had begun forming on the inside of the windows, obscuring his view even more. He cursed himself for taking the route through the forest, but turning back wasn't an option. The snow was too deep, and the truck's tires were sliding across the icy road. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes. Time was meaningless in the blinding white. Jake began noticing odd things along the roadside. Trees with strange, deep scratches running vertically up their trunks, branches that seemed to twitch as if moved by unseen hands, snowdrifts that appeared to shift subtly when he looked away. His rational mind told him it was fatigue and cold playing tricks, but the primal part of him, the part that kept him alive in the wild, was screaming that something was watching. Eventually, he reached a fork in the road, one path leading to the town and the other deeper into the forest. He knew the forest path was a shortcut, but also dangerous. For reasons he couldn't explain, he took it. The snow on that road was worse, piling high against the sides of the truck. Visibility dropped to mere feet. That's when he heard it, the faint sound of footsteps in the snow, crunching alongside the truck. He slammed on the brakes again, and the footsteps stopped. Jake froze, straining to see through the storm. His headlights barely cut through the blizzard, but there, just beyond the edge of the light, he saw a figure. It was smaller this time, hunched over, moving unnaturally fast. Its arms swung too long, almost touching the ground. The face was hidden, but he could feel its eyes on him. Panic surged, and he gunned the engine, tires spinning on ice. The figure kept pace with him effortlessly, gliding through the snow. The forest seemed endless. Every turn led to more trees, more white, more silence broken only by the crunch of the truck's tires. He glanced in the rearview mirror and saw dozens of shadowy figures lining the road, emerging silently from the snow. They didn't run, didn't walk. They just drifted alongside, matching the truck's speed, their shapes indistinct but undeniably human. Jake's mind snapped. He swerved violently, trying to shake them, but the road was icy and narrow. The truck fishtailed, skidding sideways, and he barely managed to correct it. Ahead, he could see a small clearing, a frozen pond glinting dimly in the storm. He drove toward it, hoping for solid ground, but as he got closer, the figures surrounded him. They were everywhere, emerging from the snow, standing on the ice, leaning against trees. Their faces, when he glimpsed them, were pale and frozen, eyes wide with terror, or maybe hunger. The truck came to a stop on the edge of the pond. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps. He reached for the door handle, thinking of abandoning the vehicle, but the figures pressed closer, their movements jerky, unnatural, yet horrifyingly deliberate. One leaned toward the window, its face pale, lips frozen mid-scream, eyes locked on his. The world around him seemed to slow, the snow falling like ash, the wind screaming like the cries of the dead. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. Jake blinked, and the clearing was empty, the pond smooth and frozen as if untouched. His heart pounded, ears ringing. The truck's engine roared, and he slammed it into gear, driving without hesitation. Eventually, the trees thinned, and he saw the faint lights of a distant highway. Relief washed over him, but the fear didn't leave. He made it back to Bemidji by late night, exhausted, frozen, and shaking. The next day, the snowstorm had passed, leaving the forest eerily silent. Jake told the authorities what he had seen, but no one believed him. Search teams went to the forest, but they found no evidence of footprints, no tracks on the frozen pond, and no indication that anyone else had been out there. His coworkers laughed it off, calling it winter madness, but Jake knew what he had seen. Weeks later, he began to notice changes in himself. At night, he could hear whispers carried by the wind, faint and indistinct, always calling his name. Shadows moved at the edge of his vision, lingering longer than they should, forming humanoid shapes that vanished when confronted. His sleep became restless, filled with dreams of the blizzard, the frozen pond, and the pale, frozen faces. Sometimes he woke to find the snow from that night still imprinted on his bedroom floor, even though no one had been outside. Jake tried to leave Bemidji, thinking distance would help, but the visions followed. No matter where he went, winter brought reminders, frost forming unnaturally fast on windows, sudden drops in temperature, and shadows that didn't belong. He began keeping a journal, documenting everything, the figures on the road, the frozen faces, the whispers in the wind. But each time he reread it, he noticed new details he was certain hadn't been there before. Faces in the margins, eyes staring from the pages, hands reaching from the margins. Months turned into years, and Jake became increasingly isolated. Friends stopped calling, coworkers avoided him. He never returned to the forest, but he couldn't escape it. Each winter, the memories came back, sharper and more vivid. Snowstorms seemed drawn to him, following him wherever he went. And every winter, without fail, he would hear the whispers again, faint at first, then growing louder. Come back, join us, forever. Cold. One particularly brutal winter, Jake found himself driving through another blizzard, alone miles from any town. The radio crackled with static, then a voice faint but unmistakable. Jake, help. Cold. He recognized it immediately. He had heard it before, but now it was clearer, more desperate. His pulse spiked, hands gripping the wheel. The snow thickened, reducing visibility to zero. He glimpsed movement in the corner of his eye, tall, thin figures emerging from the storm, their faces pale and frozen. The truck skidded. Jake struggled to regain control, but the figures kept pace, drifting alongside effortlessly. Panic took over. He slammed on the brakes, trying to turn the truck around, but the road was slick, and the storm seemed endless. The whispers grew louder, now surrounding him. Join us. Cold. Never leave. Forever. He could see them clearly now, faces twisted in terror, reaching for him with hands that were impossibly long and thin. The last thing he remembered was the icy wind tearing through the cab, the snow swirling into a vortex, and the faces staring through the windows. Then nothing. When search teams found the truck days later, it was abandoned, half buried in a snowdrift. There were no footprints in the snow, no signs of struggle, no trace of Jake. Only the faintest imprint of a human shape, frozen into the ice on the windshield, staring outward with wide, terrified eyes. Locals whispered about him for months afterward, warning travelers never to take that back road in a storm. Some swore they saw a truck moving through the blizzard long after Jake disappeared, headlights cutting through the white, but the driver's face always appeared pale, frozen, and impossible to identify. Every winter, when the snow falls thick and the wind howls through the pines, people in Bemidji speak in hushed tones of Jake Thornton. They say the forest claims those who wander too far into the storm, that the cold has a mind of its own, and that the frozen faces of the lost can be seen just beyond the reach of the headlights, waiting for the next traveler. And somewhere, deep in the northern woods, Jake's name is still whispered on the wind, carried by the blizzard that never ends. Story the end. The storm came fast that year without warning, sweeping across the small town of Ashwood in northern Vermont. It was late December, and the kind of cold that didn't just bite, it clawed at your skin, leaving numbness in its wake. The townspeople had seen snowstorms before, but this one felt different, heavier, somehow alive, like it was pressing down on the town with a purpose. Nathan Parker had lived in Ashwood all his life, and he prided himself on knowing how to handle winter. At 28, he worked as a logger, often in the backwoods that most people wouldn't dare venture into once the snow fell. But this year had been harsh. The cold came early, and the snow never seemed to stop. He and his best friend, Lucas, had been out in the woods that morning, trying to get a few last loads of timber before the storm made travel impossible. The day started innocuously. Snowflakes drifted lazily, and the sky was gray but calm. Nathan and Lucas joked as they loaded logs onto their sleds, unaware of the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. By midday, the wind had picked up, whipping the trees so fiercely that they groaned under the pressure. The two men knew they should head back, but they had one last load to secure, and besides, the storm didn't seem severe yet. As they made their way deeper into the woods, the visibility dropped. Snow fell so thickly that they could barely see each other. The familiar path twisted under layers of white, turning the forest into a labyrinth. Nathan's gut tightened with unease, but he shrugged it off. The woods were safe. They had been through worse. Then they heard it. A faint, scraping sound, like branches being torn from trees, but slower, deliberate. Nathan paused. "You hear that?" Lucas shook his head. "Probably just the wind." But Nathan knew better. The sound wasn't random. It was measured, deliberate, like something or someone was moving through the forest. They called out, expecting a fellow logger or a hunter, but only the storm answered. The wind howled and the snow swirled around them, a white fog that seemed to muffle every other sound. They pressed on, trying to ignore the feeling of being watched. By the time they reached the clearing where their final load of timber lay, Nathan's unease had grown into fear. Something was off. The tracks they had made that morning were gone, swallowed by the snow. But there were others. Tracks that didn't belong. Long, thin, almost inhuman, pressed into the snow in a chaotic pattern that made no sense. Lucas leaned down, squinting. "What the hell? These aren't human." Nathan swallowed hard. The tracks led away from the road, deeper into the forest, vanishing into a stand of pines. Something about them was wrong. They didn't curve naturally, yet they seemed to glide over the snow rather than sink into it. "I think we should go," Nathan said, a lump forming in his throat. Lucas hesitated. "You're scared of some footprints?" Nathan didn't answer. He knew this wasn't just footprints. Something was out there, something that had been following them, waiting. The sun was setting when they started back, the storm growing in intensity. The wind now carried a strange whisper, low and unintelligible, like hundreds of voices speaking at once, just beyond comprehension. Nathan's heart pounded as he tried to make out the path through the snow. Everything looked the same, every tree a replica of the last. Panic began to creep in. Suddenly, Lucas stumbled. Nathan turned, and in the dim light he saw a shadow moving between the trees. It wasn't human. Not entirely. Tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs bending in impossible angles. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, reflected the fading light, black and wet like pools of tar. It didn't make a sound, and yet Nathan felt the pressure of its gaze, heavy and suffocating. "Run!" Nathan shouted. They sprinted through the forest, the snow sucking at their legs, the cold burning their lungs. Behind them, they could hear something moving, fast and silent, gliding over the snow like it was part of the storm. They reached a frozen stream, and Nathan knew they had to cross it to reach the main road. The ice groaned under their weight, and for a moment, Nathan thought it would break. But then they were across, panting, terrified, the figure still unseen but certain to be there, somewhere, just beyond the snow. When they finally emerged onto the road, the town seemed distant, a faint glow on the horizon. Relief should have come, but it didn't. The snowmobile they had left behind that morning was gone. Tracks led off the road into the woods, thin, elongated, not human. Nathan and Lucas ran to the nearest house, pounding on the door. A woman answered, her face pale. "Something's out there," Nathan gasped. "We saw it in the woods." The woman looked at them, eyes wide. "You saw it?" she whispered. "Everyone's scared. Everyone's been seeing it. It comes with the storm." They didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the house, every whistle of wind through the shutters made them flinch. The snow piled higher outside, but like burying the road and any hope of leaving until morning. But the feeling of being watched never left. The next day, they tried to check on the rest of the town, but the roads were impassable. Snowdrifts blocked the streets, and the few people they encountered were terrified, murmuring about disappearances. Hikers, hunters, even a man who hadn't returned from the woods where he went to cut firewood. Nathan realized the figure they had seen wasn't alone. It was part of something bigger, something that moved with the storm and fed on the isolation and cold. By nightfall, reports of missing persons came in on the radio. Authorities blamed the storm, but Nathan knew better. The pattern of the snow, the tracks, the whispered voices in the wind, nothing about this was natural. He and Lucas barricaded themselves in Nathan's cabin, blocking windows and doors, and waited, listening to the storm and the faint scraping movements outside. Days passed, and the storm showed no sign of ending. The snow piled against the cabin, thick and heavy. The brothers could hear the sound of movement outside, slow and deliberate, like something pacing, waiting for them to make a mistake. One night, Nathan woke to a strange light outside. He looked through the frost-covered window and saw them. Figures, more than one, gliding silently across the snow, their shapes long and thin, their eyes reflecting the faint light, like black mirrors. Lucas screamed, and Nathan grabbed him. The figures stopped, tilting their heads as if studying them. Then they vanished, melting into the storm as suddenly as they appeared. Nathan and Lucas knew then that this was not something that would leave. It was tied to the winter, to the storm itself, a predator that moved with the snow and the wind, patient, immortal. By the time the storm ended, Ashwood was a ghost town. The missing were never found. Roads remained closed for days, and the snow slowly melted, revealing the footprints of things that should not exist, tracks leading into the woods and never returning. Nathan and Lucas left town shortly after, moving hundreds of miles away, trying to escape the memory, trying to convince themselves that it was over. But every winter, when the first snow falls and the wind howls just right, Nathan feels it. The presence, the cold gaze, the way the storm can hide things in plain sight and take them away without a trace. Even now, decades later, Nathan refuses to go into the woods in winter. He never ventures out during a snowstorm. And when he hears whispers on the wind, when he sees black shapes at the edge of his vision, he knows the storm is still out there, waiting, patient, and hungry. He has learned that some winters carry more than just cold. They carry the unspeakable, and when it comes, there is no escaping it. Story the end. Snow had been falling since before dawn, the kind that drifted sideways in long ribbons, sticking to the sides of houses and turning the small Montana town of Whitlow into a muted, grayscale painting. Even the plow trucks had given up by noon, and by evening the main road looked like a frozen river with tire tracks already vanishing beneath fresh layers. I had been on winter shifts before. 6 years as a county search and rescue volunteer taught me how to navigate whiteouts, stalled engines, and frightened tourists. But nothing I had done prepared me for the night of December 18th, the night I learned that sometimes nature wasn't the scariest thing waiting out in the cold. The call came at 6:47 p.m., the radio buzzing through static before dispatch's voice pushed through. Unit 4, we've got a report of a stranded vehicle out on Ridge Pass Road, black Chevy Tahoe. Caller lost signal. Last ping was about 4 miles past the ranger station. I was Unit 4 for the night anyway, and I answered automatically. Copy. On my way. My partner, Mark, leaned back in the passenger seat, boots up on the dashboard. Who the hell goes up Ridge Pass in a storm like this? Somebody stupid or desperate. I threw on my coat while the rescue truck warmed up. Either way, we're stuck doing the rescue. We pulled out of the station, the wind cutting across the truck so hard it almost pushed us into a snowbank. Out here, the cold didn't feel like weather. It felt like an organism with intent, seeping through windows, biting at any exposed skin, creeping into your lungs like frost. For the first mile, we talked about the usual things: holiday plans, the storm, Mark's never-ending complaints about the old radiator in the truck. But as we reached Ridge Pass Road, both of us fell quiet. The snow here didn't just fall. It seemed to swirl unnaturally, pressing against the windshield like a living white wall. Even the high beams couldn't cut through it. I slowed down to a crawl as the plow lines disappeared. Signal still dead? Mark checked the GPS tracker. Dead as Elvis. The Tahoe should have been in sight soon, but all we saw were drifts that rose like dunes and trees bent under the weight of white ice. Every branch looked like a hand reaching out. A few minutes later, we spotted the first sign of trouble. A strip of black rubber halfway buried in snow. Tire, Mark said. Blown. I stopped and got out, the wind slapping me so hard it stung. The tire was shredded nearly to ribbons, as if it had been torn apart rather than blown from pressure. Something about it bothered me, but I couldn't put words to it. I brushed off snow and crouched lower. Those weren't normal gashes. They looked like claw marks. Mark came around to stand beside me. What the hell? Maybe they drove over something sharp, I said, though it sounded weak even to me. We got back in the truck and continued onward until the headlights finally caught the black gleam of the Tahoe parked diagonal across the road. One headlight was broken. The driver's door hung open. Not good, Mark muttered. We parked behind it and radioed dispatch. No answer. Too much interference. I walked toward the Tahoe, shining my flashlight inside. The interior light flickered weakly. The driver's seat was empty, but the passenger side door was smeared with something dark. Snow soaked into my knees as I knelt to look closer. Blood. Fresh. Hey, Mark said quietly, standing next to me now. Look at the tracks. Footprints led away from the SUV and into the woods, a single set at first, then two more overlapping, as if whoever had been inside wasn't alone after they got out. You seeing this? Mark whispered. Yeah. Except the second set didn't look quite human. Too long, too narrow, almost like the prints from an animal that walked upright. And the stride? It was too long, too wide. Before I could say anything, a sound drifted out from the woods. A scream. Sharp. Human. Then abruptly cut off. We grabbed our gear. Rules said we should have called for backup, but there was no signal, and someone was clearly alive, at least a moment ago. The forest swallowed us almost instantly. Trees groaned as the wind forced their iced limbs to sway. Snow collected on our hats, our shoulders, our eyelashes. We followed the prints, our flashlights shaking slightly as the storm thickened. The light bounced off icy branches and created shapes that danced at the edges of my vision. 10 minutes in, we found something half buried under a fallen limb. A glove. Inside it was a hand. Mark swore harshly, stepping backward. The hand was severed cleanly, not torn, not chewed, as if sliced off with something sharp. But there was nothing sharp out here. Before we could decide whether to turn back, we heard another sound. Faint, rhythmic, almost like breathing. A harsh, ragged inhale followed by a wheeze. I shined my light toward the noise. A man lay slumped against a tree. Snow piled in his lap, frost clinging to his beard. His eyes were wide and glassy, but he blinked when the light hit him. "Sir," I said, crouching beside him. "Can you hear me? Are you hurt?" His lips moved, but no sound came out. Mark leaned in. "We need to get him to the truck." I nodded, sliding my arms under the man's shoulders. As we lifted him, his head lolled forward, and I caught a glimpse of his neck. 3 deep gashes raked across his skin, perfectly parallel. My stomach tightened. "What did this to you?" He tried again to speak, this time managing a strained whisper. One word. "Run." Something cracked in the woods behind us. We spun around, flashlight sweeping between the trees. Snowflakes whirled like ash in the beam. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "we need to move. Now." He grabbed the man's other arm, and we started dragging him back toward the road. The forest seemed to press in around us, branches shifting, snow falling harder and faster. Another crack sounded, closer this time. Then a low growl threaded through the wind, so faint I almost convinced myself it was imagination. Almost. We moved faster. The man moaned, his breaths growing shallower. My arms burned from the weight, and my boots slipped on buried roots. Then I saw movement ahead. Something tall, something pale, something not shaped like a bear or a wolf. Based purely on the height, it had to be over 7 feet. My flashlight caught only glimpses, bone-white limbs, joints that bent wrong, something like fur or hair clinging in patches. I stopped walking. I couldn't help it. "Do you see it?" I whispered. Mark swallowed. "Yeah." The thing didn't approach. Not yet. It just watched, its head tilting slowly, too slowly, like it was curious. I wanted to run, but the injured man between us made that impossible. The creature moved, one step, then another, silent, smooth, controlled. We started backing away, pulling the man awkwardly through snow that reached mid-shin. My breath came in stabbing bursts of cold. The creature stopped again. Its chest expanded as it inhaled, and I swear the sound that left it wasn't a growl. It was almost a laugh. My panic finally snapped into instinct. "Drop him," I said. "We can't outrun it like this." "We can't leave him," Mark snapped back. "If we don't, we're dead too." He hesitated, jaw clenched, breath fogging the air. Then he nodded. We laid the man gently in the snow. His eyes fluttered open weakly. Mark whispered, "I'm sorry," before we turned and ran. Branches whipped our faces. Ice cracked beneath our boots. I didn't dare look behind me and sound like bones snapping echoed in the trees. When I did glance back, I saw the creature crouching beside the injured man. Saw it lean closer. Saw its jaw unhinge in a way no human jaw ever could. I turned away before it reached him. Some things you don't survive seeing. The next few minutes blurred into a desperate sprint, lungs burning, fear overriding every sense. When the headlights of the rescue truck finally cut through the trees, they seemed like salvation. We threw ourselves inside, slammed the doors, and I floored the accelerator. The truck fishtailed, but caught traction just long enough to send us barreling down the pass faster than safety allowed. Only when we reached town limits did I pull over, hands trembling violently. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Mark said, "We have to report it." "No one will believe it. You saw it." "I know what I saw," I whispered. "But they'll think the storm messed with us, or that we panicked, and the body, if anything's left, will be gone before anyone gets out there." He slumped back in the seat. "So what do we do? Stick to the truth. A mauled victim, a creature we couldn't identify, and that we barely made it out." We filed the report. They sent a team out the next morning after the storm calmed. They never found the man's body. Never found his hand either. But they found the Tahoe, and they found the trees around it gouged with deep, unnatural claw marks. The official conclusion was animal attack, likely a bear driven out of hibernation. But Mark and I never accepted that, because bears don't stand upright. They don't watch you from the trees like they're studying you, and they sure as hell don't laugh. To this day, I still avoid Ridge Pass, even in summer. Some nights, when the wind hits the trees just right, I swear I hear that same low rasp threading through it. Not quite a growl, not quite a laugh. Something in between. Story, the end. The snow had been falling for days, relentless and heavy, turning the small town of Northfield, Vermont, into a silent, white prison. The roads were slick and dangerous, and the trees bent under the weight of frost and ice. Mark Sullivan, a 34-year-old paramedic, had been on call for nearly 24 hours straight, responding to crashes, slip-and-fall injuries, and calls from stranded motorists. By late evening, he was exhausted, his hands raw from the cold, but he still had one more call before he could head home. It was a remote stretch of Route 9, a winding road that cut through thick forests and rolling hills. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "Unit 12, we have a report of a car in a ditch. It's been there for at least 2 hours. The driver hasn't been heard from." Mark acknowledged and drove cautiously, headlights cutting through the blizzard. Visibility was nearly zero, the snow falling so thickly it felt like driving through a wall of white. When he arrived, he found a small, dark-colored sedan, half buried in snow, its hazard lights barely flickering through the storm. The surrounding forest was silent. almost unnaturally so, and the wind seemed muffled under the thick blanket of snow. Mark grabbed his flashlight and approached the car. The driver's side window was frosted over and the door was locked. He knocked, calling out, but there was no response. Mark tried the door handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open and was met with an eerie stillness. The interior was empty. The heater had been running, but the driver was gone. He stepped back, feeling the wind whip snow across his face, and checked the road behind the car. No footprints, no tire tracks leading away. It was as if the driver had vanished into thin air. He radioed dispatch. Unit 12 here. The car's empty. No sign of the driver, requesting backup and possibly police assistance. There was static. Then the dispatcher replied, "Backup is delayed. Stay put until units can reach you. Be careful. Visibility is extremely low." Mark pulled out his thermal blanket and wrapped it around himself, deciding to wait near the car until help arrived. That's when he noticed something strange. A single set of footprints in the snow leading from the edge of the woods to the front of the car. They were large, heavy, and deep, but they didn't match the tire tracks. And strangely, they didn't continue past the car. They stopped abruptly, as if the person had simply disappeared. Unease settled in his stomach. Mark's years of emergency experience had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, something felt very wrong. He scanned the tree line with his flashlight. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending and twisting in ways the wind shouldn't allow. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned back toward the car, and that's when he saw it. Movement, or what looked like movement, just beyond the tree line. A figure emerged slowly, shrouded in snow. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and its movements were jerky, almost mechanical. Mark's heart raced. The figure didn't wave or call out. It just watched, head tilted slightly, as if studying him. He radioed dispatch again, but the radio emitted only static. The wind had picked up, drowning out any signal. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice trembling. No response, only the whistling of the wind. The figure began to move toward him, and that's when Mark noticed the details. Its face was obscured by a hood, but the outlines of its body were disturbingly elongated. The arms were too long, the fingers too thin, and it moved in a way that defied natural motion. Instinct took over. Mark ran to his ambulance, fumbling with the keys as the figure followed silently, gliding through the snow as if it didn't touch the ground. He started the engine, the heater roaring to life, and backed the vehicle onto the road. His headlights barely penetrated the storm, but he could feel eyes on him, tracking every movement. As he drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, snow piling higher and higher against the tires. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. Mark's relief was brief. The radio came alive with a distorted voice, whispering his name over and over. It wasn't dispatch. It was soft, insistent, and unmistakably human, but wrong. There was something wrong with the tone, a vibration beneath the words that made Mark's teeth ache. He reached the town finally, pulling into the station. He told the dispatcher what he had seen, but when officers arrived at the site the next morning, there was no car, no footprints, no sign of a driver. The road was smooth, untouched by anything but snow. Mark's colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. "Maybe you were hallucinating from exhaustion," one suggested, but Mark knew what he had seen. Weeks later, Mark couldn't shake the memory. The snowstorm had passed, the town returned to normal, but he had started noticing strange things. Footprints in his driveway at night, too large and deep to be his own, shadows that seemed to linger longer than they should, whispers that came through the static of old radios when the wind howled, and always the sense of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the tree line. It got worse in January when another storm hit. Mark was home alone when the power went out. Snow pounded against the windows, and the silence inside the house felt heavy, oppressive. He lit a few candles and tried to relax, but then he heard it, the soft tapping of fingernails against the window. He froze. The tapping became scratching, scraping along the glass, slow and deliberate. Mark grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the window, but the snow outside was too thick. He couldn't see anything, yet the sound continued, circling the house. Panic rising, he called 911, but the line was dead. He tried his cell phone, no signal. The scratching escalated, now joined by a low, wet breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Mark grabbed a kitchen knife and moved cautiously through the house, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The air was freezing despite the fireplace, and the shadows cast by the flickering candlelight seemed to move independently, stretching across the walls. Then came the whispering. Soft, unintelligible at first, but growing louder, more distinct. "Mark, come outside." He bolted the doors and windows, but the whispers penetrated every barrier, echoing through the walls, through the floor, through his mind. It was impossible to ignore. He felt a presence in the room with him, something immense, bending reality around it. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost all meaning. By morning, the storm had subsided. The house was silent. Mark checked every window, every door. Nothing. No footprints, no damage, no evidence that anyone or anything had been there. But he didn't sleep that day. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside reminded him that it hadn't been his imagination. Mark never went out during storms again. He never traveled alone on remote roads. But sometimes, when the snow falls heavily and the wind howls through the trees, he feels it again. The presence, watching from just beyond the light, waiting. And sometimes late at night when the wind rattles the windows, he swears he hears his name, soft and insistent, calling him back to the snow. He moved out of Northfield eventually, fat trying to leave the terror behind. But the winter never truly left him. He dreams of snowdrifts, of dark figures gliding silently through the storm, and he wakes sweating, listening for scratching at the windows, wondering if they've followed him. And he knows, deep down, they have. Story the end. The storm hit Maple Hollow without warning. One moment the sky was a dull gray, the next it had turned an unrelenting white, as if the clouds themselves had dropped onto the earth. Snow fell so heavily it was impossible to see more than 20 feet ahead, and the wind carried with it a biting cold that penetrated clothing, bone, and sanity alike. The town had been warned weeks earlier about the approaching blizzard, but warnings rarely mattered in a place like Maple Hollow. The town had always been isolated, nestled in a valley surrounded by dense forests and jagged hills. The storm simply made that isolation absolute. Anna Thompson had lived in Maple Hollow her entire life. She was used to cold winters and occasional power outages, but this storm was different. It wasn't just snow, it was oppressive, almost alive. By mid-afternoon, streets had vanished under deep drifts, the telephone lines were down, and the entire town was cut off. She had stocked up on essentials, but as the hours wore on, the food, water, and heat that had seemed sufficient began to feel inadequate, fragile against the unending storm. She lived alone on the edge of town, in a small house built in the 1960s, just before the forest thickened into untamed wilderness. It was the sort of house that creaked and groaned with the wind, the kind that made shadows on the walls seem alive at night. Anna had been watching the snow fall through her living room window when she first noticed something strange. Footprints in the snow leading from the tree line toward her home. She frowned. There hadn't been anyone outside for hours, and she certainly hadn't seen a soul approach. The footprints were large, far bigger than a human's, with a strange irregularity to them, as if the weight had been unevenly distributed. They stopped at the edge of her porch, as though whatever had made them had paused to look inside. Her heart began to pound. She told herself it was probably just an animal, perhaps a deer, maybe a stray dog, but something about the tracks made her skin crawl. Night fell quickly, and with it came a heavy silence. The wind outside had shifted, no longer carrying the comforting howl of the storm, but something darker. A scratching, a low, dragging sound that seemed to circle the house. Anna tried to focus on mundane tasks, reading, tidying, checking the woodpile, but the sounds persisted, growing closer with each hour. They weren't random. They were deliberate, methodical. Someone or something was moving around her house. By midnight, the tapping had started. Light but insistent, like nails rapping on the window. She froze, listening. The sound came again, louder, closer, and then another, a scraping along the siding. She could feel her pulse in her throat. She went to the door, peering through the peephole, but saw nothing. Only the storm, only the blinding white snow, and the shadows of the trees swaying like silent sentinels. Anna tried to call the police, but the lines were dead. She had no neighbors close enough to hear her scream. She was alone. The logical part of her mind told her it was probably just a branch, or maybe the weight of the snow on the roof. but her instincts screamed otherwise. Around 2 a.m., she heard a sound she would never forget, a low, guttural moan, far too deep for any human, echoing through the trees. It was followed by another, closer this time, almost as if the sound had circled the house. She could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. Panic rising, she grabbed the old hunting rifle her father had left behind years ago and locked all the doors and windows. Then the back door shook violently, as though something massive was trying to force its way inside. Anna raised the rifle, aiming toward the shadows outside. For a moment, everything froze, the snow suspended midair in the windless pause. Then she saw it, a figure standing just beyond the porch, towering, hunched, impossibly thin, its face hidden beneath a hood or shadow. Its limbs were too long, the fingers ending in points that caught the dim light from the living room. It didn't move like a person, it glided. Anna fired once, the report deafening in the small house. The figure didn't flinch, it simply remained there, watching, until a bright flare from the fireplace briefly illuminated its face. Hollow eyes, pale and unnatural, stared back at her. Then it vanished, as if swallowed by the snowstorm itself. Morning brought no relief. The storm had subsided somewhat, leaving the landscape unrecognizable. The streets of Maple Hollow were buried under several feet of snow, and the footprints she had seen outside were gone, erased by drifting white. Yet the feeling of being watched remained, persistent and suffocating. Anna decided she couldn't stay. She packed her car, but as she drove toward the main road, she kept catching glimpses of movement in the trees, shadows that didn't belong, shapes that seemed too tall and unnatural to be human. On her way out of town, she passed a frozen creek. In the ice, she noticed patterns etched into the surface, swirling, spiral-like marks that hadn't been there before. They radiated outward, perfectly symmetrical, yet impossibly precise, and she felt a shiver run through her body. It was the same pattern she had glimpsed on the figure the night before, burned into her memory. Anna didn't speak of what she saw for years. People laughed when she mentioned the footprints, the scratching, the moaning. Cabin fever, they said. Snow's playing tricks on you. But she knew what she had seen, and she knew what she had felt. Something alive in the winter, something patient, something that watched from the shadows and waited for the right moment to strike. Years later, she heard stories of disappearances in the region. Hikers, travelers, even locals who never returned after venturing into the forest during a snowstorm. Some were blamed on hypothermia, some on getting lost. But a few cases didn't add up. Bodies found in strange positions, deep in the snow, faces frozen in terror, spiral-like marks nearby, burned or pressed into the ground in ways no human could create. Anna avoided Maple Hollow entirely after that, moving south where winters were milder, where snowstorms were short and predictable. But the memories stayed with her. Every winter, when the first snow fell, she would hear faint tapping in her dreams, low, guttural moans echoing through her mind. Sometimes she would wake, convinced she could feel cold breath on her neck, shadows moving at the edge of her vision, as though the figure had followed her through the miles and years. She never forgot the feeling of those hollow eyes staring back at her, the sensation that the winter itself had consciousness, waiting, patient. And she never returned to the edge of the forest, never tried to explain what she had seen, because deep down, she knew that some truths are better left unspoken. The snow hides everything, she realized, the tracks, the signs, even the terror itself, until it is too late. Occasionally, she would hear rumors of the cabin she once occupied. New owners reported strange noises, shadows that moved independently of light sources and spiral marks burned into the wood of the porch. They laughed it off at first, assuming it was a prank, a quirk of the winter. But like Anna, they began to feel it. The oppressive watchfulness, the sense that they were never truly alone. And every winter, as the snow fell heavier than reason, they realized that the cold wasn't just weather. It was alive. It was patient, and it never forgot. Anna never went back, but she always carried the warning with her. When winter comes, the snow isn't just snow. The silence isn't just silence. And the shadows aren't just shadows. Something waits there, just beyond sight, for the snow to cover the tracks, for the wind to carry its voice. Something that never leaves, something that remembers. Story the end. Snow had already buried most of the county line by the time I headed north out of Duluth. It was late December, the kind of late where Christmas lights were still up, but already half swallowed by drifts, and the sky never really got brighter than a dull gray bruise. I was driving up to check on my uncle's old cabin, more out of obligation than anything else, after a neighbor reported that a limb had gone through one of the windows. My uncle had passed the year before, and the cabin sat empty most of the time. No one wanted to buy something that far out in the woods anymore, not with winters like these. The road twisted deeper into the pines, narrow enough that snowplows only bothered after big storms. Every mile felt like I was shouldering deeper into something ancient and indifferent. The wind pushed snow sideways across the road, and the forest creaked, long, slow groans that sounded almost like animals. By the time I reached the cabin, my knuckles were stiff from gripping the steering wheel. The place looked worse than I expected. Snow was piled high against the small porch, and the roof had a sag I didn't remember. The broken window gaped like a missing tooth, shards of glass glinting under the weak daylight. I parked, killed the engine, and the silence that settled felt heavier than the cold. Just the wind, moving through bare branches, and somewhere far off, the hollow cracking of ice. Inside, the place smelled like damp wood and mice. My boots crunched over glass as I pushed the door open. The fallen tree limb lay half in and half out of the living room, and snow had blown inside, forming a small drift across the rug. I sighed, rubbed my hands together, and set about pulling the limb back out through the window frame. It took longer than I thought. The damn thing had splintered deep into the sill, and by the time I dragged it out onto the porch, the sky was already darker. I hammered a tarp over the window, nails stiff between my fingers, and only after I stepped back did I notice something odd, tracks coming from the tree line. Not animal tracks, not deer or fox or snowshoe hare. Human, barefoot. I stared at them, not believing at first, because the idea was too absurd. The prints were wide and deep, toes clearly defined, moving from the forest's edge straight toward the cabin, then looping around the side. The wind hadn't erased them. Someone had been here. Someone without boots, without shoes at all. The prints trailed behind the cabin, somewhere I couldn't see without circling back there myself. I swallowed, felt the cold bite deeper, and reminded myself that people did weird things all the time. Maybe someone got turned around on a snowmobile trail. Maybe they'd taken off their boots from hypothermia confusion. But the prints looked purposeful, straight, no staggering. Night was coming fast. I didn't want to follow them, not then, not alone. So I forced myself back inside, lit the propane heater, and set water to boil. The quiet settled again, heavier than before. I told myself it was fine. People wandered. The woods were full of hunters, trappers, hikers, but something about those prints kept crawling back into my thoughts. They were too clean, too perfect, as if whoever had made them wasn't bothered by the cold at all. As darkness swallowed the windows, the wind picked up again, rattling the tarp I'd nailed over the broken frame. I sat in the armchair with a mug of hot water. It was all I could make without trekking to the pump out back, and tried to settle in for the night. That's when I heard it. Not the wind, not the creaking. A thump, then another, coming from outside. I set the mug down slowly. The sound came again, closer now, like something heavy stepping onto the porch. I reached for the flashlight beside the chair and flicked it on. The beam cut through the dim cabin interior like a blade. Another step, wood groaning. Someone was out there. I stood, moving quietly, and approached the front door. My breath puffed white in the cold air. The heater hadn't warmed the place as much as I'd hoped. I paused, listening. Silence. Then scratching, slow, deliberate, right beside the door frame. I stepped back instinctively. "Hello?" I called, instantly regretting it. No answer, just the wind pressing snow against the walls. I waited another minute, then edged toward the small window next to the door. I lifted the curtain with 2 fingers. The porch was empty. The freshly fallen snow across the boards was smooth, untouched. No prints, no marks, no sign of anything. I let the curtain fall. Every hair on my neck stood stiff. The scratching had been right there, feet on the boards. I wasn't imagining it. I triple-checked the locks and backed away from the door. The wind howled and shoved at the walls. The tarp snapped loudly, making me flinch. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at the door, too afraid to lie down, too tired to stay fully alert. My head drooped more than once. At some point, I couldn't say exactly when, I heard something new. A whisper. Close. Inside? No, not quite inside. The sound was drifting in from the broken window, threading through the tarp, a soft, low voice. Not words, just breath, like someone murmuring too softly to understand. It rose and fell, almost soothing, except every instinct in me screamed to hide. I edged toward the window, flashlight trembling in my hand. I wanted to shine it through the tarp, but the whispering stopped before I reached it. I held my breath. Nothing, only the storm. I exhaled shakily and stepped back. Then, knuckles tapping lightly from the other side. Tap, tap, tap. I stumbled backward and nearly tripped over the armchair. Whoever or whatever was out there was right beside the window. Go away, I shouted, voice cracking. The tapping stopped. Silence swallowed everything. I didn't sleep. Not a second. I sat in the chair, blanket around my shoulders, flashlight pointed toward the window, waiting for dawn like it was salvation. When the first gray hint of morning crept through the remaining unbroken panes, I forced myself outside. The world was blinding white, and the tracks, those barefoot tracks, were everywhere. Circling the cabin, approaching every window, standing at the door, but none leading away. They just stopped, as if whoever made them vanished. My breath fogged the air as I crouched to look closer. The prints were crisp and deep. No melting, no distortion. They'd been made recently, maybe even during the night. Except I hadn't heard footsteps in the snow. I'd only heard them on wood. Close. Too close. I packed my things, locked the cabin, though it suddenly felt meaningless, and headed straight for the truck. The engine complained, but finally turned over. As I turned to back out, I caught movement in the rearview mirror. A figure. Standing at the edge of the trees, too pale, too thin, barefoot, just watching. My body went cold all over. I blinked, wiped the fog from the mirror, looked again. The figure was closer, only yards away now. The face, I couldn't fully make out details, just sunken features, eyes too dark, skin the color of old ice. The mouth hung open slightly, as if breathing slow, steady clouds into the morning air. Except there were no clouds, no breath. I slammed the truck into drive and tore out of there, snow spraying from the tires. I didn't look back again until I'd hit the main road, and by then the figure, if it had ever been real, was gone. I didn't tell anyone at first. What would I say? That something followed me, that something watched me through the walls of my uncle's cabin, but the neighbor who'd called me checked on the cabin the next day. He phoned me immediately. Who the hell was with you up there? He demanded. No one, I said. Why? Because there are footprints everywhere, bare footprints, and they go right up to the windows, then stop, like whoever made them disappeared. I didn't reply. He went on, you might want to come look at this. This looks like they walked right up to the door while you were inside. I couldn't. I didn't go back. Not ever. The cabin still stands, last I heard. No one's lived there since. The for sale sign sits half buried each winter, frost climbing in lacework across the rusting metal. Sometimes on the coldest nights, the neighbor swears he hears knocking from somewhere in the woods. Soft, rhythmic, like someone still looking for a way in. And every year, when the first heavy snow falls, new footprints appear, bare, human, always leading toward the cabin, never leading away. I don't know what I encountered that night. I don't want to know. All I can tell you is this. Some things in the winter woods don't feel the cold. Some things don't need breath. Some things wait. And sometimes they find you. Story the end. Snow had already buried most of the cabins on the ridge by the time I arrived in early January. But my sister insisted she and her husband needed help. Their generator kept sputtering out, and with the cold snap gripping northern Minnesota, losing power for even a few hours meant real danger. I'd grown up around harsh winters, so I didn't hesitate. I packed a duffel bag, drove 8 hours north, and reached their property just before dusk. The place looked smaller than I remembered. A single-story cabin with cedar siding, crouched at the tree line like something trying to hide from the wind. The porch light flickered weakly as I pulled in. My sister, Claire, opened the door before I made it up the steps, bundled in 2 hoodies and a wool cap. Her face lit up when she saw me, but it didn't erase the exhausted heaviness in her eyes. You came fast, she said, hugging me quickly before rushing me inside. It's been getting worse. The generator shuts off every night around 2. Same time. Then we hear things. Hear things? I laughed as I stomped snow from my boots. Probably animals. It's not animals, she said sharply. You'll see. Her husband Ben was hunched over the wood stove, feeding it more logs than necessary. Sweat ran down his temples even though the inside of the cabin wasn't warm enough to justify it. He glanced up at me with the wary, hunted look of someone who hadn't slept in days. We ate a simple dinner, canned chili and stale cornbread while they explained everything. 3 nights in a row, the generator cut out at exactly 2:11 a.m. Not 2:10, not 2:12. Then the cabin would settle into the kind of cold that seeped straight into your bones. That was when the knocking started. Sometimes on the walls, sometimes on the windows. More than once, they'd seen shadows moving outside. Not human shadows, they were too tall, too thin, too wrong in the way they stretched and warped in the moonlight. I tried to hide my skepticism, but Claire caught it anyway. "You think we'd drag you up here in the middle of winter for nothing?" She snapped. "No," I said, "but exhaustion does things to people. Cold does too. Let me stay the night. I'll see for myself." They exchanged a glance that made my stomach tighten. Not hopeful, not reassured. More like, "You'll wish you never came." The night settled in fast. They only had 2 bedrooms, so I took the pull-out couch in the living room, positioned near the generator room door. I could hear the machine humming steadily outside, a low mechanical heartbeat. By 10, both Claire and Ben were in their room with the door shut. I turned off the main light, leaving only the orange glow of the stove. The hours dragged. I dozed off for maybe 20 minutes at a time, half waking every time the wind scraped across the eaves. At 1:50 a.m., my nerves kept me awake for good. The cabin groaned and shifted as if settling into the deep freeze. I stared at the red digits of the microwave clock from across the room. 2:08, 2:10, 2:11. The generator cut off. Not sputtered, not choked, just stopped. Clean, sudden, like someone had flipped a switch. Silence rushed in behind it, the kind of silence that becomes pressure wrapping around your skull. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders. Then came the knocking. It started softly, 1 tap on the kitchen window, then another on the far wall. Then 3 quick knocks against the back door, too fast and too deliberate to be an animal. I stood and crept to the window above the sink. The moon was full enough to illuminate the yard. Snow fell in thin waves, almost glittering. I didn't see anything until something moved near the tree line. A figure, tall, at least 7 feet, thin as a lamppost. Its arms hung lower than they should. I blinked, thinking maybe I was half dreaming. But it stepped forward, slow and strange, like every limb bent 1 joint too many. Something scratched against the living room window behind me. I spun around. A long, narrow shadow stretched across the snow outside that window. The shadow of something reaching toward the glass. I backed away, heart pounding so violently I felt it in my throat. From the hallway, I heard Claire whisper my name. I turned to find her standing barefoot on the wooden floor, shivering violently. "You saw it too," she said. Before I could answer, Ben rushed into the living room holding his rifle, but something was wrong with him. His eyes were wide and glassy, pupils blown huge. He stared at the window like he was hypnotized. He didn't even seem to notice us. "Ben?" Claire whispered harshly. "Look at me," but he didn't. He walked to the front door, unlocking the deadbolt with slow, mechanical movements. I lunged forward. "Ben, stop!" Too late. He swung the door open. A blast of cold air exploded into the cabin. Beyond him stood nothing but swirling snow. For 2 seconds, everything was still. Then something tall and black flickered between the trees. Closer now. Much closer. I slammed the door shut and threw the lock. Ben didn't fight me. He just stood there, staring, breathing too rapidly, like he'd run miles. "They call," he murmured. "They call you out to the cold." Claire grabbed him by the face, forcing him to look at her. "Ben, stay with me." I pulled them both toward the kitchen, where we huddled near the stove, the only source of heat left. My brain raced. None of this made sense, yet I couldn't deny what I'd seen. The wind picked up again, but this time it carried something with it. A voice. Not words, more like a low moaning rhythm, rising and falling across the snow like a chant. It scraped at the windows, it slithered through the cracks in the walls. Every hair on my arms lifted. "What the hell is that?" I whispered. "They mimic," Claire said. "They sound almost human. Sometimes it sounds like crying. Last night, it sounded like my dad." Our father had been dead 5 years. The moaning grew louder, circling the cabin. Then came footsteps on the porch, slow, crunching steps that paced back and forth. Ben covered his ears and rocked, whispering over and over again, "Don't answer. Don't answer. Don't answer." Then something whispered his name through the door. Perfectly. Exactly as Claire would say it. "Ben." He jerked like he'd been shocked, and his eyes snapped open. "That's not her," I said, grabbing his arm. But he tore away from me with surprising strength and bolted to the door, tugging at the lock. "It needs help," Ben cried. "It's hurt. It needs help." Claire screamed, rushing forward to hold him back. I grabbed the door handle and leaned my weight into it as something pushed from the other side. Not slamming, just pressing, slow, steady, and humanly patient. The voice on the other side whispered again, this time sounding like a little girl. "Cold, please. Cold hurts." "Don't listen," I growled. "It's not real." The pressure on the door stopped. Then the entire cabin shook as something slammed into the roof. Snow dislodged and crashed past the windows. The three of us froze, staring upward as heavy, dragging footsteps walked across the shingles. Then claws scraped, slow and deliberate, like whatever it was, had settled flat against the roof and was crawling to the edge to peer inside. A long, skeletal hand reached down from the roofline and curled around the living room window frame. Claire backed away, shaking uncontrollably. "We can't stay here. We have to get to the truck." "No," I said. "We wait for morning." "We won't make it to morning," she whispered. The hand at the window slowly tapped the glass with a single knuckle. Tap, 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 Ben whimpered. I grabbed my coat and yanked on my boots. "Fine, we go. Now." The generator was housed in a small shed next to the truck. If I could get it running, maybe we could flood the area with light and noise. Maybe that would buy us time. We bolted to the back door. Claire kept one arm locked around Ben's waist, forcing him forward even as he tried to turn toward the windows, toward the whispers. I pulled the door open and the three of us sprinted out into the snow. The cold hit like a physical blow. The air burned going into my lungs. The shed was only 30 feet away, but the dark between us felt endless. Halfway across the yard, a figure stepped out from behind the truck. Tall. Bent. Wrong. It cocked its head at us, jerky and unnatural. Another shape unfolded from behind the shed, then another from the tree line. Claire screamed and shoved Ben toward the truck. I grabbed her wrist and dragged her behind me. The shadows moved faster now, closing in. I didn't think. I just raised the small emergency flare gun from my pocket and fired straight into the air. Light exploded across the yard, painting everything red. The creatures froze, not like animals startled, more like they weren't used to light, like it hurt. Their limbs twitched. Their shadows thrashed wildly on the snow. "Go!" I yelled. We stumbled to the truck. I threw myself into the driver's seat, turned the key, and prayed. The engine coughed, then roared to life. The flare burned out. The shadows moved again. One slammed its hand against the windshield, its fingers spidering across the glass like branches. Its face, or the place where a face should have been, pressed close. Nothing but darkness. No eyes, no features, just a hollow, gaping absence. I slammed the truck into gear and floored it. The thing rolled off the hood as we sped down the driveway, snow flying in sheets behind us. Claire sobbed quietly in the back, clinging to Ben as he murmured nonsense into her shoulder. We didn't stop until we reached the county road, miles away from the cabin. Only then did I look back. Nothing followed. Not that we could see. We made it to town just after sunrise. A local sheriff drove back up to inspect the property. He claimed he didn't see any footprints except ours. He said maybe we were hysterical, maybe carbon monoxide, maybe exhaustion. We didn't argue. Neither Claire nor Ben ever returned to that cabin. They sold it within a month. The new owners lasted only 2 weeks before abandoning it without explanation. Every so often, especially in deep winter, I still wake at 2:11 a.m., and sometimes when the house is very quiet, I swear I hear knocking on the windows. Story the end. Snow hammered the windshield in dense, wind-blown sheets that made the world ahead look like a white, endless tunnel. The wipers on my old Ford rattled back and forth, barely keeping up. I'd driven through Montana winters my whole life, but that night felt different, like the storm had something personal against me. I was supposed to make it from Helena to Wolf Creek before the worst of it hit, just over an hour normally. But reports of deteriorating conditions kept pinging through the radio, and the storm had accelerated so fast it felt unnatural. The last clear landmark I recognized had been nearly an hour earlier, and now I wasn't even positive I was still on the frontage road. Everything looked the same. White sky, white road, white fields burying the fences. My phone had lost service 20 minutes ago. My stomach clenched when the truck lurched as if hitting a mound. I slowed to a crawl. Something about the quiet, no other cars, no distant engines, no signs of life made my breath quicken. Even the radio had turned to static. I spotted a faint yellow glow ahead, flickering through the storm. A house? A barn? A vehicle? I didn't care. I needed shelter, or at least someone who knew these roads better than I did. As I got closer, the shape of a cabin emerged from the storm, squatting at the edge of a tree line. No lights besides the flicker I'd seen through a side window. Smoke curled weakly from a chimney. The driveway was half buried, and no other vehicles were there. I pulled in, tires crunching over ice, and killed the engine. The cold immediately filled the cab. I shoved the door open and stumbled out, my boots sinking nearly a foot into the snow. The wind bit at my face as I hurried up the warped wooden steps. I knocked. Loud. Nothing. I knocked again, harder, calling out. "Hello? Anyone home? My truck's stuck in the storm." The door creaked open before I touched it again, as though the latch hadn't been properly closed. A long, hollow draft slipped out from inside, colder than the wind behind me. "Hello?" I repeated, pushing the door open farther. A wood stove crackled weakly in the corner, the fire too low to give real heat. The single lamp I'd seen flickering was a candle on the table, its flame swaying as if disturbed. The cabin smelled of old pine, melting snow, and something else, metallic, faintly sour. "Anyone here?" I tried again. No answer. Snow gusted in behind me, so I shut the door. The moment it clicked shut, the wind's howl vanished. Cut off so suddenly, the cabin felt soundproof. I moved farther inside. The place was small, maybe one main room and two doors leading off the back. A mug of something half-frozen sat on the table. A jacket hung on a peg near the door, half iced around the collar as though it had been left there straight from the cold. Someone had been here recently. "Sorry to barge in," I said to the empty space. "Storm's bad. I just need directions or to wait it out." Silence. Then a faint creak from one of the back rooms. I froze, listening. Another creak. Slow, rhythmic, like something rocking. My pulse hammered as I stepped toward the sound. Maybe someone needed help. Maybe someone was hurt. But when I pushed the first door open, the room was empty except for a bed with rumpled blankets and frost clinging to the inside of the window. The second creak came from the other door. I swallowed and opened it. The smell hit me first, rot mixed with frozen blood. The small room was colder than the outside, practically an icebox. A few shelves lined the wall. Something hung from a metal hook in the ceiling. I stepped inside without meaning to. Then my eyes adjusted. It was a deer, or at least I thought it was, until I saw the hands, human hands. Blue, stiff, frozen hands tied at the wrists. The body was coated in a thin glaze of ice. The face was hidden beneath a burlap sack. I stumbled backward, gagging. My shoulders slammed the doorframe. That's when a soft voice came from behind me. "You shouldn't be here." I spun so fast I slipped on the frost-slick floor, catching myself against the wall. A woman stood near the table, wearing a heavy parka and snow pants, hood down, dark hair stuck to her cheeks with melted snow. I had no idea how she'd entered without me hearing the door. I'm sorry," I stammered. "The storm, I didn't know anyone was home." I called out. Her eyes were dull and wide, like she hadn't slept in days. "Nobody should be out here during a storm like this," she said. "It comes fast. Comes hungry." Her voice quivered on the last word. I pointed toward the other room. Is that a person?" Her expression twisted, like she might cry or scream or both. "My brother," she whispered. "He didn't make it back before dark. They freeze so quickly when it finds them." "When what finds them?" She closed her eyes, shaking her head. "You should leave. You shouldn't have come up the road. It follows the warmth. It follows the breath." I thought she was in shock or delirious from the cold, maybe alone too long in the woods. I raised my hands carefully. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about your brother, but we need to get you help. We can take my truck if—" A sharp tap on the wall cut me off. Not from the door, from the outside. High up, near the roofline. The woman grabbed my wrist hard. "Don't look at it." Another tap. Then a scraping sound that traveled along the side of the cabin like nails dragging on wood. "What is that?" I whispered. She didn't answer. She pulled me toward the table, blowing out the candle instantly. Darkness swallowed the room, except for the faint glow from the dying embers in the wood stove. The scraping moved to the roof. Slow, deliberate, heavy. "Get down," she hissed. We crouched behind the narrow kitchen counter. I could hear something moving above us, something larger than any animal that had business on a cabin roof. The boards creaked under its weight, snow shifting as it crawled. The temperature dropped even more, the air turning sharp and painful to inhale. A soft thud hit the porch outside, followed by the crunch of snow under something walking. 2 steps, 3, then the door handle jiggled. My breath caught. The woman squeezed her eyes shut, mouthing something silently, maybe a prayer. The door handle turned again, harder this time. Then it repeated, fast, like someone testing how much force it could take. Then the knocking started. Except it wasn't knocking. It was imitating it. The pattern wasn't human. Too fast, too precise, too curious. Tap, 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 tap. Silence. Tap, 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 tap. My chest tightened painfully as the wind died completely outside. The storm noise vanished. Everything became still, unnaturally still. A voice spoke through the door, but it was my voice. "Hey, anyone home? My truck's stuck in the storm." The woman's hand clamped over my mouth as I nearly choked in terror. My own voice continued outside, perfectly mimicked. "Hello? Anyone here?" Then it laughed. Not loud, but low, crooked style, bending the sound like a frozen branch cracking. The woman leaned close to my ear. "It hears everything you say. It learns fast. If you answer it, if you look at it, it keeps you. It freezes you from the inside and wears your voice." The scraping returned to the roof, running above us, faster now, like it knew we were hiding and found the game entertaining. I whispered, barely audible. "How long has it been out there?" "Since December 1st, she breathed. "Every winter it takes someone. This time it took my brother. He was strong. He didn't make it 10 minutes after he looked at its face." The scraping stopped above the window. A shadow fell across it. Something tall, thin, too angular to be a person. Then it pressed against the glass. I didn't see its face, but I saw enough. Long limbs bending wrong, skin stretched too thin, something jutting where an eye should have been. Frost webbed across the pane instantly, crawling outward like veins. The woman shut her eyes and whispered shakily, "Don't move. Don't breathe loud." But my breath was already fogging too loudly in the cold. The thing's head turned sharply toward us. The window groaned as cracks spidered across it. "Run," the woman whispered, standing abruptly. "What?" "It's already marked us." The window shattered inward with a blast of icy wind. I screamed and ducked. Something long and sharp whipped through the air, slicing the table in half like balsa wood. The woman grabbed my coat, dragging me toward the back door. We stumbled into the freezing storage room where her brother's body hung. She shoved the rear door open. The storm outside was gone, completely. No wind, no snow falling, just a white, silent forest stretching endlessly. I heard it climbing through the broken window behind us, joints cracking like frozen tree limbs snapping. "Go!" she shouted. I ran. The snow was deep but strangely firm, like packed ice. My boots slapped against it as I sprinted toward the trees. Behind me I heard her scream, not of pain, but of fury, as if trying to distract it from me. It worked. The scream cut off abruptly. Something heavy moved in the snow, but I didn't dare look back. The trees were too thin to hide behind. The silence made my own footsteps sound like gunshots. Half a mile out, my lungs burning with cold, I saw lights. Headlights. A snowplow pushing slowly up the access road. I waved my arms wildly and stumbled toward it. The driver leaned out, wide-eyed, as he saw me. "Jesus Christ, kid, you all right? You look half froze." "Cabin, something's at the cabin. There's a woman," I gasped. "What cabin?" he shouted over the engine. I pointed behind me, but all that was there was white forest. No cabin, no chimney, no footprints, nothing. "I swear," I panted, "it was right there, a cabin with a wood stove. Her brother." The driver looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Ain't no cabin in these woods. Closest one burned down in the 80s. Nobody's lived out here since." My stomach dropped. My teeth chattered hard enough to hurt. He hauled me into the plow, wrapped me in blankets, and radioed for rescue. They searched the area. They found my truck. They found my footprints. But nothing else. The storm returned before nightfall, burying the tracks. For weeks afterward, I dreamed of the tapping, the scraping, my own voice laughing outside the door. Winter still comes early in Montana. And every 1st of December, I wake up freezing no matter how warm the house is. Because somewhere in those woods, somewhere just off the road I took that night, something remembers me, and it knows my voice. Story, the end. The first snow had come early that year, blanketing the small town of Pine Hollow in a cold, suffocating silence. It wasn't the picturesque kind of snow that made people bundle up to take cheerful walks. It was the kind that arrived fast, in sheets, coated everything in white, and seemed to press against your chest if you stayed outside too long. For the residents, it was more than inconvenient. It was a warning. Winters in Pine Hollow were brutal, but this one felt different, heavier, colder, more relentless. Margaret Klein, a schoolteacher in her early 40s, had lived in Pine Hollow her entire life. She knew the winter patterns like the back of her hand, and she knew when something didn't feel right. That morning, she had shoveled her driveway at 5 a.m., the snow already up to her knees, her breath forming thick clouds as she worked. Her neighbor, Harold, an elderly man who never left his house in winter unless necessary, waved from his porch. There was something in his eyes that unsettled her, a quiet fear, the kind you only see in people who have lived in the same place for decades and have seen things no one else believes. "It's coming early," Harold muttered, more to himself than to her. "Worse than last year." Margaret nodded, though she didn't understand. Last year had been harsh, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary. Harold's warnings had always been dramatic, a relic of his age and the many storms he had weathered. Still, there was a weight to his words this time. By midday, the snow had turned from soft, powdery flakes to something thicker, wetter, more oppressive. Driving was nearly impossible. The few cars that ventured out struggled to move, sliding on icy patches that had formed beneath the surface. Margaret decided it was best to stay home. She stocked up on firewood, bread, and canned goods, but even as she prepared, a gnawing anxiety settled in her chest. It wasn't just the weather. Something about the way the town had gone silent, the way the wind carried whispers through the bare trees, was wrong. That night, the storm intensified. The wind howled against the windows, shaking the frames, rattling the old house as if it were warning her to leave. Margaret wrapped herself in a thick quilt and sat by the fireplace, trying to read, but her eyes kept straying to the darkness outside. The snow fell endlessly, piling up against the doors and windows, burying everything in sight. The town, usually alive with the soft glow of streetlights and the occasional car, had disappeared under a wall of white. At around 11 p.m., Margaret heard it, the first sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, almost indistinguishable from the howling outside. But it grew, a dragging, scraping noise that made her stomach twist. She froze, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the road in front of her house. She couldn't see through the blizzard, but the noise was unmistakable, metal scraping against ice, slow and deliberate. Margaret considered calling the police, but she remembered the warnings about driving in the storm. No one would come, and besides, she was alone. Heart pounding, she moved to the window and peered out through the frost-covered glass. There was nothing. No car, no figure, just the endless snow. The sound stopped. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination. The storm was playing tricks on her mind. But sleep did not come easily. Every gust of wind, every creak of the house felt amplified, threatening. Around 2 a.m., the noise returned, louder this time. She recognized it immediately. It wasn't metal on ice. It was footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through deep snow, coming closer to her house. Margaret's phone had no signal. She couldn't call anyone. The footsteps paused outside her front door, then circled the house, slow and steady. She clutched a kitchen knife, telling herself she was imagining things, but she could hear the snow compress under something or someone. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time lost meaning in the storm's relentless grip. By dawn, the blizzard had eased slightly, leaving a thick layer of snow that blocked the roads completely. Margaret looked outside and saw something she couldn't explain. Footprints. Not human, at least not entirely. They were long, uneven, dragging, sinking deep into the snow. They circled her house and then vanished toward the woods behind her property. The next day, she learned that the storm had trapped everyone in town. Roads were impassable, power lines were down, and the small grocery store had run out of supplies. People huddled in their homes, listening to the wind and the snow, sharing stories of strange noises in the night. Harold's neighbor, an old man who lived alone on the other side of town, had gone missing. His house was found empty, the doors locked from the inside, and a trail of those same strange footprints led away into the forest. Fear settled over Pine Hollow like ice. By the third day, it became clear that whatever was outside was not deterred by doors, locks, or snow. Livestock disappeared from barns. Dogs and cats vanished from yards. People reported seeing shadowy figures in the woods, always at the edge of visibility, always watching. Some claimed the figures were impossibly tall, hunched and moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. Others described glowing eyes that reflected the faint light of the snow. Margaret tried to keep calm. She stayed inside, only peeking through her windows. She noticed patterns. The footprints always appeared after nightfall, circling houses before vanishing into the woods. And the wind carried whispers, faint and urgent, words she could almost understand but never fully did. Go, leave, not safe. By the fifth day, the townspeople had begun to panic. Some attempted to leave despite the snow, but none returned. Cars were found abandoned, doors open, engines running, but no one inside. The storm persisted as if it had a purpose beyond the weather itself. Rumors spread of people being dragged from their homes in the night, vanishing without a trace, leaving only the marks of those dragging footprints in the snow. Margaret stayed in her house, barricading the doors and windows. She could hear them circling outside, listening to her heartbeat through the walls. Sleep became impossible. She survived on canned food and snowmelt, never venturing outside. The cold seeped into the house despite the fire, chilling her to the bone. She began to hear voices in the wind, repeating her name, calling her to the woods. She refused to answer. On the seventh night, the snow stopped falling. The storm had passed, leaving a silence so complete it was suffocating. Margaret, exhausted and terrified, ventured outside for the first time in days. The town was unrecognizable. Buildings were partially buried, trees snapped under the weight of snow, cars half buried in drifts, and the footprints, they were everywhere, circling every house, converging toward the center of town. At the town square, Margaret found the source of the footprints, dozens of them, moving as if drawn to a single point. In the center of the square was a figure impossibly tall, hunched, covered in ice and frost. Its face was hidden, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with malice. Margaret froze, unable to move, as it turned slowly toward her. For a moment she thought it might speak, but instead it raised a long, clawed hand, and the wind screamed like 1,000 voices. She ran, not stopping until she reached the edge of town, where the forest began. Behind her she could hear the snow crunching, but when she dared to look back, the figure was gone. The town remained silent, abandoned. Margaret eventually made it to the highway and was rescued by a passing truck driver. She told him what happened, but the authorities found nothing. No signs of the townspeople, no footprints in the snow beyond the forest, no explanation. Margaret never returned to Pine Hollow. She moved hundreds of miles away, trying to forget. But every winter, when the first snow falls, she feels it, the weight, the silence, the feeling of eyes watching from the tree line. Sometimes she wakes in the night to the sound of dragging footsteps outside her window, circling her house, just like in Pine Hollow. And she knows deep down that one day, if she isn't careful, they will come for her again. Story the end. The cold that year didn't feel like normal cold. It had weight, a heaviness that pressed against the bones and settled under the skin, even when you were indoors. People in northern Minnesota joked that every winter had at least one night that made you rethink living there. But the winter of 2014 had entire weeks like that. I was living about 20 miles outside Ely, working maintenance for a small lakeside resort that shut down after Thanksgiving. My job was simple: keep the pipes from freezing, check the cabins once a week, and make sure the generators were fueled in case the power went out. The resort owners spent the winter in Arizona, so from December to April, I was alone on the property except for the occasional snowmobiler who wandered too far off the trail. I'd lived in winter my whole life and never minded the solitude. But that year, the isolation worked on me in ways I didn't recognize until it was too late. My place wasn't much, just a one-bedroom cabin with a propane heater and a radio that barely caught the nearest station on good days. The lake behind the resort froze thick as concrete by early January, and the forest around it went quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Even the wolves were scarce, and when you don't hear wolves in northern Minnesota, something's off. The first odd thing happened during a routine walkthrough of Cabin 7. It was the furthest of all the units, tucked near the tree line with a view of the lake. As usual, I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and waited a second for my eyes to adjust. It was standard procedure. Sometimes animals got in through vents, and the last thing you want is to surprise a raccoon. But that day, the smell hit first. Not animal smell, not garbage, not mold. Something metallic. Something cold, like open freezer air mixed with iron. I stood still, listening. Nothing moved. No scratching, no breathing, no wind whistling through cracks. When I checked the kitchen area, the faucet was dripping. That alone didn't scare me. What scared me was that the water dripping out wasn't water. It was ice. Fully formed, solid ice droplets were hanging from the faucet as if time had stopped mid-drip. I tapped one with my glove and it broke off like a marble hitting the floor. The pipes were shut off. There shouldn't have been anything in them, frozen or not. I chalked it up to leftover moisture, a weird coincidence. Something I wouldn't have thought about again if the next night hadn't happened. Around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of something banging on my cabin wall. Not tapping, not settling wood. A heavy, deliberate thud, 3 times in a row. I sat up, heartbeat pounding in my throat. The banging stopped, and the silence after was so complete it felt staged. I threw on my coat and boots, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold slapped me instantly. My breath hit the air and crystallized so fast it looked like smoke. I scanned the trees, the snowpath, the roofs of the cabins. Nothing. No tracks near my cabin except mine going in. Then I heard it, far off, near Cabin 7. A long, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the frozen snow. Normally, I might have waited until morning, but something in me felt tense, like the quiet around the resort wasn't empty but holding its breath. So I walked toward Cabin 7, each step crunching in the hard snow. My flashlight beam caught branches, ice crystals, the edge of the cabin roofs, and then something else. For half a second, I saw a figure near the trees. It wasn't moving, just standing there. A man, maybe, or someone shaped like one. I called out, "Hey, you're trespassing!" No answer. I moved the light back, but whatever I'd seen wasn't there anymore. The snow, where it had stood, was untouched. When I reached Cabin 7, the air felt wrong, like standing beside a generator, a vibration so faint you don't hear it but feel it. The dragging sound had stopped, but I saw something near the back door, a mark in the snow, as if something wide and flat had been pulled up to the cabin. The shape ended at the threshold. I unlocked the door, heart hammering. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than outside, but not comfortably warm, stale warm, like someone had just been there. Everything looked in place except the window facing the lake. Frost had spread across the entire glass, but in the frost, something had been traced by a fingertip. Letters. Words. Let me in. I stepped back so fast, I slipped on the floor and hit the corner of the counter. For a moment, I lay there, staring at the words. The frost pattern was fresh. My flashlight beam made the crystals sparkle. I didn't touch anything else. I locked up and went straight back to my cabin, not caring about the rules, the routine, any of it. I sat awake until dawn with my coffee going cold and the radio hissing static. I tried to tell myself someone had broken in. Maybe a lost hiker. Maybe some kid messing around. But I knew what fresh tracks in snow looked like, and there had been none. None leading in, none leading away. The next week brought temperatures so low the state issued warnings not to go outside unless you had no choice. I stayed indoors, checking the cabins only when absolutely necessary. For 5 days, nothing happened, and I started believing I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, the radio went dead. Not a sudden click, not fading out. 1 second it murmured static, the next second it was silent, completely silent. Even turning the dial made no sound. I tried my phone. No signal, not even the emergency band. I went outside to clear my head, forcing myself to check the generator house. The moment I stepped onto the porch, something sharp and cold brushed past my ear, fast, like a fingertip made of ice. I spun around. Nothing. But I wasn't imagining the cold. It was too localized, too deliberate. Inside my coat, my skin prickled like something had skimmed right through the layers. As I walked to the generator house, I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision. Small, sudden flickers, dark shapes slipping between trees, always gone when I turned. When I reached the generator house and opened the door, the heat should have hit me. That generator ran hot enough to warm the building even at 40 below, but inside, everything was frozen. A full inch of ice coated the walls, the generator casing, even the tools hanging from hooks. A wrench lay on the floor, frozen solid to the concrete. Frost clung to the ceiling like white moss. The generator itself was silent. I didn't understand how it could have frozen so completely without me hearing it stop. The pipe that fed warm exhaust outside was clogged with something that looked like packed snow, but snow didn't climb pipes against gravity, and it didn't leave long drag streaks the way this stuff did. When I touched it, it crumbled like ash mixed with frost. I backed out, went straight to my cabin, and locked the door. I didn't sleep that night. I kept hearing things, snapping twigs, distant thumps, a low humming on the windowsill like someone breathing on the glass. Around 4 in the morning, I saw the frost forming on the inside of my bedroom window. Slow, delicate crystals spreading outward like veins. Then the same words appeared again, etched by an invisible fingertip. Let me in. By the next day, I was done pretending this was something normal. I packed what I needed, fueled the truck, and tried to leave. The truck didn't start. It wasn't frozen, it was dead. Battery drained like someone had hooked it to a vacuum. Fine. The snowmobile. But when I got to the storage shed, the machine looked like it had been dragged across the floor. Its front end pointed toward the open door as if something had tried to pull it out but stopped halfway. The scratches in the ice were deep, gouged like made by claws. I slammed the shed door shut and ran back to my cabin. The light inside was dim, darker than it should have been, and when I looked at the floor, I saw wet footprints, bare footprints, leading across the room and stopping right in front of the closed bedroom door. I felt the cold on the other side before I even reached for the knob. Something was in there. I didn't open the door. I turned, walked out of the cabin, and didn't look back. I started walking down the resort road toward the highway, 10 miles away. No plan, no supplies, just my coat, gloves, and the instinct to get away before nightfall. The forest around me felt alive, watching. Every sound echoed, my footsteps, my breath, the creaking trees. When I passed the turnoff to Cabin 7, I heard something behind me. A voice, or something trying to sound like a voice. Not spoken, but whispered inside my ears like cold fingers pressed against my head. Let me in. I ran. I didn't stop, not even when I heard the footsteps behind me, crunching fast in the snow. Not even when something brushed my coat from behind. Not even when the whisper swelled into a howl so sharp it hurt. I didn't stop until I reached the highway and flagged down a passing plow truck. The driver told me I looked like I'd been frostbitten all over. My ears, hands, neck. I don't remember any of that. I just remember sitting in the truck, heat blasting, and still feeling a cold spot on my shoulder where something had touched me. I never went back to the resort. The owners hired someone else. I don't know what he found, and I didn't ask. Sometimes in the deep of winter, when the temperature drops and the frost crawls across my apartment windows, I see shapes forming in the ice. Fingertip patterns. Sometimes they look like letters. Sometimes they look like hands. But I never let them finish forming. Because I know exactly what they want. Story the end. The first real cold snap of December rolled in earlier than anyone expected. The kind that seemed to hollow out the air and make every sound brittle. I was driving north through rural Montana on my way to spend a few quiet weeks at my uncle's hunting cabin, something I'd done plenty of times in warmer months but never in winter. He had passed away that summer and left the place to me. I hadn't been ready to deal with it then, but after months of nonstop work and too many sleepless nights, isolation in a quiet forest felt like the right kind of escape. The sun was slipping behind the mountains when the first flakes began to drift across the windshield. I wasn't worried at first. Montana got worse weather than this every other day in winter. But the higher I climbed, the more the wind seemed to change direction, swirling the snow instead of letting it fall. The forest lining the road grew darker, dense evergreens leaning inward, their branches weighted down like they were bowing to something deeper inside the woods. 10 more miles, I told myself. That was all. Then heat from the wood stove, a can of chili, and the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. But then, just after a sharp bend, something darted across the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck fishtailing on the fresh snow. The shape had been too quick to make out, maybe a deer, maybe something else, but the movement had been wrong somehow, almost crawling instead of running. Heart pounding, I crept forward in the truck, leaning over the wheel to scan the trees with the headlights. Nothing moved, not even the branches. The air felt weirdly still for a storm beginning to build. I shook it off and kept driving. By the time I reached the long dirt road leading down toward the cabin, the snow was falling harder. The road had only a faint twin track where a friend from town had driven up the week prior to drop off some supplies for me. I eased along the path at a crawl. The storm was coating the ground faster than my tires could clear it. The cabin came into view as a dark rectangle in the trees, exactly as I remembered it. But something looked different. I couldn't place what until I turned off the engine and the headlights cut out. The cabin had always felt welcoming, even a little nostalgic. But now, with night pressing in and the storm hissing through the trees, the place looked almost abandoned. Not just empty, abandoned. The front door was closed, the windows dark, the porch bare, but there were tracks leading from the tree line behind the cabin, clear depressions in the fresh snow that hadn't been made by any animal I knew. They looked like footprints, but each step was oddly deep and spaced too far apart. Whoever made them had either been running or had a very large stride. I stood still for a long moment, listening. Nothing. Just the wind shifting through the pines. I told myself they were old. Left by the friend who dropped off the supplies, snow could fall in strange patterns. Shadows could make things look off. Inside, I unpacked, started a fire, heated the chili, and tried to settle in. The storm thickened outside, and the wind found every crack in the cabin's old wood to whisper through. Sometime around 9, the power flickered once and went out entirely. I wasn't shocked. The lines up here were ancient, and as long as the wood stove worked, I'd be fine. But around 10, as I was sitting on the couch flipping through a book, I heard something brush against the outside wall. Not wind, not snow. Something solid, dragging slowly along the planks. I lowered the book without breathing. The dragging sound stopped. I waited, my ears pricked, listening so hard it hurt. Then, a single soft knock on the door. Not frantic, not forceful. Just one, a deliberate tap. Every instinct in me said not to open that door. I couldn't see anything through the small window next to it. The porch light wasn't on, with the power out. My phone had 1 bar of service, barely enough to load a text message if I held it against the window. I considered calling for help, but hesitated. What would I say? Someone knocked on my door? Out here, sometimes people did wander onto the wrong property in storms. Lost hunters, drunks, folks from town who took a wrong turn. The knock came again. Just one. Slow, almost polite. I picked up the poker from next to the stove and approached the door. "Who's there?" I called. Silence. The storm raged, but no voice answered. I waited another minute before stepping back. If someone truly needed help, they'd speak up, they'd shout. They wouldn't stand silently on a porch in a blizzard. Eventually, the dragging sound resumed, moving along the cabin's exterior wall, circling slowly, methodically. Each step crunched heavily in the snow. Whatever was out there wasn't small. The sound trailed off behind the cabin. I listened until even the wind swallowed the last noise. That night, I barely slept. Every groan of the wood and crack of ice on the roof made me sit upright. But nothing else happened. By morning, the storm had passed. Light filtered through the spectral blue sky of early winter. I stepped outside cautiously, the cold biting instantly at my skin. The tracks were back, those long, deep depressions. They circled the entire cabin and disappeared back into the woods. They were fresh, very fresh. My heart thudded. A bear could leave deep tracks, sure, but none I'd ever seen walked in a perfect circle around a structure, and these were spaced wrong. Too long, too even. I almost left right then, packed up the truck and drove back to town. But something nagged at me. A stubbornness, maybe, or pride. This place was mine now. I wasn't going to be chased off after one weird night. I tried to enjoy the day, gathered firewood, checked the generator, hiked down to the frozen creek, but the whole time I felt watched. The woods had a strange hush to them, like the snowfall had blanketed every sound except my own breathing. Even the birds were absent. It wasn't until late afternoon that I realized the forest had grown unnervingly silent. No wind now, no snow falling, just a suffocating stillness. I turned back toward the cabin, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far tree line. Tall, motionless, half shadowed beneath the branches. It was too far to make out more than an outline, but every hair on my neck stood up. It wasn't a hunter. Hunters wore bright colors, and they moved. This thing didn't move at all. I blinked once, twice, and the figure slipped backward into the trees, almost like it was retreating without using its legs. I didn't run. I told myself not to run. Running would make me vulnerable. Panicked. Instead, I walked swiftly back to the cabin and locked every door and window. Night fell faster than usual, like the sun itself was hurrying to get away from the forest. Around 7, the dragging sound returned, slow, deliberate, scraping against the wood. My breath fogged as I backed away from the door. The sound circled again, same as the night before. But this time, every few seconds, there came a soft, wet exhale, like something breathing heavy and close. The wind wasn't blowing. This wasn't the storm. This was outside my door. When the knock finally came, it was louder. Still only one, but harder, more confident. I dialed the sheriff's office, but the call dropped instantly. No signal. Even the one bar I'd had was gone. Another knock. "Say something," I yelled. "If you need help, say something." Silence pressed in. I don't know how long I stood there, poker in hand, heart pounding like a drum inside my skull. It felt like an hour, could have been 5 minutes. Eventually, the knocking stopped. But the breathing didn't. It stayed outside my door for a long time, longer than I could bear. And when it finally moved away, the footsteps thudded so heavily that the windows rattled. Sometime after midnight, the sound stopped completely. When dawn came, I mustered enough courage to step outside. The tracks were everywhere. Circling, doubling back, irregular patterns suggesting the thing had paced for hours. Then they wandered into the woods behind the cabin. I followed them only far enough to see something that made my stomach twist. Halfway up a tree trunk, at least 10 feet in the air, deep claw marks raked across the bark. Fresh. Sap still oozing. Nothing natural could reach that high. I packed the truck in less than 10 minutes. As I threw the last bag in, something cracked deep in the trees. Not a branch breaking, something heavier, like a joint popping in a massive limb. I froze. The woods were silent otherwise. Another crack. Closer. I turned the ignition, floored the gas, and peeled out of the driveway, snow kicking up behind me. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't want to see anything following. The entire drive down the mountain, I kept checking the tree line. Every shadow felt too tall. Every shape looked vaguely familiar. Like the figure I'd seen the day before was keeping pace just out of sight. Only when I reached the main road and saw another vehicle did my breath finally escape my lungs in a shudder. I didn't go back to the cabin. Not that winter. Not since. A month later, when I finally told a local about what happened, he got quiet and said something I still can't forget. "That mountain's got stories," he murmured. "Old ones, about something that walks when the snow falls heavy, something tall. Don't look at it full on, they say. Don't open your door when it knocks. Whatever's out there doesn't want shelter, it wants company. I still dream about the knocking sometimes. Slow, one time, always one." Story, the end.